Night comes fast on the old world, not because the sun moves differently, but because everything outside the ring of vision is alive with consequence. A slope of dry grass can hide lions. A stand of trees can hold silence that means nothing, or silence that means something has already begun to move. The air itself feels crowded thick with scents of damp earth, old ash, animal fat trampled roots, and the cold mineral smell that rises from stone after the last heat leaves it. Somewhere beyond the reach of immediate sight, hooves strike hard ground and vanish again. Somewhere else, hyenas laugh in the dark with a human cruelty that is older than humans. A small band of people presses close to a fire that is not yet the centre of a world, only a brief defence against one. They are not the first humans, if that word is allowed to stretch backward through forms that do not yet look entirely familiar, and they are not the last who will live in fear of being eaten before morning. They belong to a long interval when survival is physical, immediate, and narrow. The margins are thin. The body is everything. Hands matter because they grip, carry, strike, scrape, and hold. Eyes matter because they catch movement at a distance. Memory matters, but only in the most practical sense. Where water lies after dry months, which valley traps cold air, which fruits sicken children, which cliff path lets a hunter corner something larger than himself. Knowledge exists, but it clings close to the ground. The landscapes around them are not stable backgrounds in any comforting sense. They lurch and shift across generations. In some places, grassland opens under a wide white sky, and the horizon seems to promise safety only because danger can be seen from far away. In other places, forests gather along rivers dense and shadowed, full of insects, hidden water and ambush. Shorelines advance and retreat. Lakes swell, then shrink to bitter shallows. Seasons sharpen, fail, or arrive out of rhythm. What survives in the record suggests that ancient humans do not inherit a calm planet in which to become themselves. They inherit fluctuation. They inherit pressure. They inherit a world that keeps changing the terms. Long before cities, before kings, before plagues written into chronicles, before carved stone ever tries to preserve a name, climate is already acting like a silent ruler. It changes rain. It changes vegetation. It changes where the herds go, which predators follow them, which valleys stay green, and which roots become death traps. A few wet centuries can open corridors through lands once too dry to cross. A few cold millennia can close them again. Glaciers build far away, and even people who never see ice feel the consequences in wind sea level and the movement of animals. Scholars still debate exactly how particular climate pulses affect human behavior in different regions, because the evidence remains incomplete, and local realities matter, but no serious reading of the deep past leaves climate out for long. It is always there, enormous and indifferent, rearranging the board. The people moving through this world are not masters of it. That comes much later, and even then only partially. Here they are one animal among many, and not an especially dominant one when measured by muscle claw speed or teeth. Alone, a human body is vulnerable in almost every obvious way. Skin tears, bones break, children remain helpless for a painfully long time. Birth is dangerous. Old age, when it exists at all, arrives burdened by wear rather than dignity. Infection can start from a cut no larger than a thorn wound. A bad season can thin a group before anyone fully understands that the pattern has changed. Even success is temporary. A carcass won after risk and effort can still be stolen by something stronger. Shelter can fail, fire can go out, water can turn foul, and yet the species persists, or rather a chain of related human forms persists, because vulnerability is not the same thing as helplessness. These people watch, they learn, they move, they endure losses that would empty any later myth of its heroism. A child dies, a mother survives, a hunter does not return. The band shifts course without ceremony, because grief cannot halt migration. A wound heals badly and becomes part of how a person walks for the rest of his life. A broken tooth changes what can be eaten. Winter drought, flood ashfall, the sudden absence of game, the arrival of unfamiliar rivals. None of these are exceptional events in the old world. They are the weather of existence. The predators are not simply background threats. They're competitors in an intimate and brutal economy. Big cats take the same herbivores humans want. Hyenas strip what others leave. Packs of wild dogs can outrun endurance, and birds circle over the slow collapse of anything weakened. In some regions, enormous raptors likely pose danger to children. Crocodiles wait where the river narrows into necessity. Venomous snakes claim shade, rock clefts, and abandoned burrows. Even large grazing animals are dangerous in a way later imagination sometimes forgets. A wounded aurochs, a panicked horse, a cornered boar, these can kill quickly and without meaning to. The ancient human world is not a stage filled with symbols. It is full of weight. There is another pressure too quieter in the record, but no less important. Humans are not alone among humans. For long stretches of prehistory, multiple human lineages share the wider world. Some are close cousins, some more distant. They do not all live in the same places or the same ways, but the human story is not a single-file procession of one neat form replacing another. It is braided, overlapping, and often uncertain. Bones appear in one cave, tools in another, footprints in ancient mud elsewhere, and scholars spend decades arguing over whether a find represents a new branch, a local variant, or a familiar population behaving in an unfamiliar way. No single explanation fully accounts for the complexity. But the broad truth remains: before the later human world takes shape, there are several ways of being human, and they inhabit a planet that does not owe permanence to any of them. This is why the old world feels so tense when viewed honestly. Nothing about later human success is guaranteed here. The outcome has not yet hardened into inevitability. A dry corridor could stay closed. A population could fail to recover. A rival lineage could endure longer, spread farther, or adapt differently. A coastline rich in shellfish and seabirds could nourish one generation and drown the traces of it 100,000 years later. The evidence that survives is scattered and biased toward luck. Bone preserves only under certain conditions. Wooden tools rot. Fibers vanish. Campsites wash away. Whole chapters of human experience are almost certainly missing, erased, not because they were unimportant, but because deep time is selective. What survives in the record suggests fragility everywhere, even in moments of innovation. Still small details gleam through. A cut mark on bone, a hearth stain darkening ancient sediment. Pigments carried farther than immediate necessity would demand. Carefully chosen stone from a source not just nearby but preferred. Shells with no nutritional value turning up inland. These clues do not yet form a full portrait, and in this early stretch of the story, they should not be forced to say more than they can. But they hint that even before the great turning point, something is gathering. Not certainty, not civilization, not destiny. Only pressure accumulation, and the slow thickening of possibility. For now, though, most of life remains brutally present. Dawn begins with cold. Limbs stiffen on waking. Embers must be coaxed or fire remade. The group reads the morning not as scenery but as instruction. Wind direction, cloud shape, tracks in damp soil, which birds are calling and which have gone quiet. The day's movement will depend on all of it. A nursing woman adjusts her pace to the group without complaint because there is no alternative. An adolescent learns by carrying, watching, failing and repeating. An older individual, valuable not for strength but for remembered roots and habits, notices a detail others miss: broken reeds near the marsh edge, a change in dung, a silence where there should be insects. These things matter. Later humans will build institutions to store knowledge. Here knowledge walks on tired feet, and over all of this hangs the strange fact that at some point only once something changes enough that the human story no longer feels merely like survival among many forms of life. Afterward, humans remain mortal, anxious, violent, hungry, and exposed to climate. But they become different in ways that spread and stay. Their social worlds deepen, their symbols multiply, their cooperation grows stranger, wider, more deliberate. They begin to carry not just tools but meanings. They become more than present tense creatures. The mystery is not whether this happens, it does. The mystery is what exactly happened, where, how gradually, and why it never quite reverses. That answer does not begin in triumph. It begins here in uncertainty, in wind over grass, in a continent opening and closing its roots, in a species not yet secure enough to imagine itself exceptional. Before humans become the animal that remakes landscapes and remembers worlds that no longer exist, they spend an immense span of time with no guarantee of future dominance at all. They crouch at the edge of firelight while the dark presses close. They listen for teeth. They sleep lightly. They wake and move again. And the old world, immense and unsentimental, keeps testing what they are. Pressure shapes them long before it teaches them anything like mastery. It decides who eats first, who keeps up, who falls behind, who survives a storm, who notices a spore half erased by wind, who can walk another 10 miles with cracked skin and an empty stomach because there is simply no place to stop. In this older human world, survival is not a noble abstraction. It is a series of calculations made without language complex enough to dignify them. A ridge offers visibility but no shelter. A river offers water but also crocodiles, insects, and the animals that come to drink. A grove offers fruit for a week, perhaps 2, but no certainty beyond that. Every decision has a cost, and many of those costs are paid in bodies. The bands are small because the world makes smallness practical. Too many mouths will strip a place too quickly. Too many feet will leave too many signs. Too many children will slow movement beyond safety. But smallness has its own danger. One infection, one failed. Hunt, one accident at the wrong season, and the group's future narrows at once. The death of a strong adult is not merely personal grief. It is lost carrying power, lost knowledge, lost vigilance, lost reproductive possibility, lost speed in flight, lost authority in moments when fear could split a band apart. Scholars still debate how stable these early social units are across different periods and species, because the evidence remains incomplete, and behavior does not fossilize as neatly as bone. Yet what survives in the record suggests societies that are intimate, exposed, and highly sensitive to disruption. The children reveal the burden most clearly. Human childhood is unusually long, and that is a gift only in worlds that can afford it. Here it is a gamble with sharpened edges. A child learns, slowly, depends deeply, and consumes resources before contributing much in return. To raise even one to maturity is a massive investment in food transport, protection, and patience. A mother carrying an infant is not simply nurturing life. She's moving through a predator-rich landscape with reduced speed and altered balance. Her body still recovering from one hazard while already exposed to the next. The evidence from later hunter-gatherer societies can illuminate some possibilities, but no direct analogy is perfect. Even so, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that ancient human survival is bound to cooperation from very early on. No solitary strategy explains the raising of human young. Even before the deeper transformation comes, dependence is already written into the species. That dependence, though, exists inside scarcity rather than comfort. Food is not one thing. It is a shifting mosaic of risk and opportunity. Some days it is marrow cracked from scavenged bone, greasy and precious. Some days it is roots dug from hard soil, bitter but sustaining. Some days it is shellfish pried from a shoreline if the tide allows and the coast is close enough to matter. In some regions, small game may offer more reliability than the dramatic pursuit of large herbivores. In others, carrion might provide more calories than glory ever could. The image of ancient humanity as a procession of heroic hunters is too simple to be useful. What survives in the record suggests flexibility, opportunism, and constant adjustment. Meat matters certainly, but so does patience, plant knowledge, timing, and the willingness to take what can be had. This is one of the lesser-known truths buried in the romantic dust of prehistory. Hunger rewards practicality more than valor. A person who can recognize a seasonally reliable tuber, find bee nests without being driven off, collect eggs without falling, or identify which nuts require processing before they are safe, may contribute as much to survival as the individual who lands a thrust into large prey. Ancient life does not divide neatly between the heroic and the domestic, because the distinction belongs more to later storytelling than to deep survival. In reality, success depends on a wide portfolio of skills, many of them quiet and easily lost from the archaeological record. Fibers used for carrying, digging sticks shaped from wood, knowledge of smoke-water insects and the movement of birds. The old world is full of expertise that leaves almost no trace. At the same time, movement never stops being central. To stay alive is often to keep going. Populations shift not because they are restless in any modern sense, but because landscapes stop paying out. A marsh dries, a herd changes route, a grove fails after cold snaps. Waterholes shrink into muddy pits ringed with desperate prints. Wind carries dust instead of the smell of rain. When that happens, a band must either know where to go or discover it at cost. Migration, even on a local scale, is not a grand march. It is aching feet, children on hips, old injuries reopening arguments over direction, and the silent knowledge that turning back may be worse. The world after rain and the world after drought can feel like separate planets occupying the same ground. There is danger in meeting others too. Another band might mean exchange mating information and fresh alliances. It might also mean contested water-stolen food violence and infection. The deep past does not easily reveal whether strangers are usually greeted with caution, hostility, or opportunism, and likely the answer changes across time and place. But there is no reason to imagine innocence here. Competition exists not because humans are uniquely cruel, but because scarcity sharpens every boundary. A spring that can sustain one group may not sustain two. A cave with defensible depth may become worth fighting over when cold intensifies. Even where direct evidence for conflict is sparse, the logic of the environment presses hard enough to make tension plausible. Human social life begins under constraint, not abundance, and constraint enters the mind as surely as it enters the body. To live under this kind of pressure is to become exquisitely responsive to threat. Sudden movement matters. Unfamiliar sounds matter. Weather on the horizon matters. The smell of rot on the wind matters. A child wandering out of sight matters immediately, not abstractly. These are not just external conditions, but habits of nervous systems. Long before any philosophical awareness of mortality, the body is already learning vigilance. The difference between noticing and failing to notice can be one's blood in the dust. It is possible, even likely, that such prolonged ecological pressure shapes not just behavior, but selection itself, favoring memory coordination, emotional sensitivity to group signals, and the capacity to learn from others quickly. Exactly how and when these traits deepen remains debated, but the old world is plainly sorting for something beyond brute force. One detail often overlooked makes the pressure even more severe. Humans are creatures of energy imbalance. Their brains are expensive organs, their young are costly, their movement across large territories demands calories that are difficult to secure with regularity. This means that periods of scarcity are not occasional interruptions to an otherwise balanced system. They are woven into its structure. A few lean weeks can alter fertility, immunity, migration choices, and group cohesion. A single failed season can change who lives long enough to reproduce. A cold interval can favor one strategy over another, one body over another, one region over another. No single explanation fully accounts for the larger transformation that will come later, but energy stress sits near the heart of many serious explanations. To become different humans may first need to be made uncomfortable for a very long time, yet pressure alone explains nothing unless something can answer it. Many species endure pressure and remain broadly what they are until they vanish. Humans do not. Or rather, one lineage of humans does not. The question is why? For now, all that can be said is that in this long prelude the ingredients are assembling. Demanding climates, unstable habitats, long childhoods, heavy dependence on knowledge transfer, flexible diets, complex movement, social risk, rival human forms, nervous systems tuned to uncertainty. None of these guarantees an outcome, but together they create a species that cannot survive by instinct alone. It must lean harder on learning, on imitation, on memory shared beyond one body. That shared memory is still limited. It lives in gestures, repeated routes, familiar places, handling techniques, perhaps proto-linguistic sounds rich enough to coordinate but not yet to build worlds inside the mind. The evidence remains incomplete, and no fossil can settle the birth of language. But something important is already visible even without full language in place. Humans survive best when knowledge does not die with the knower. A group that remembers the hidden spring through one dry season has an advantage. A group that remembers which stone fractures cleanly has an advantage. A group that can pass on the rhythm of tides, the habits of scavengers, the danger of a plant, the best season for crossing a marsh has an advantage. This seems obvious now, but in evolutionary terms it is profound. It makes survival increasingly collective, and collective survival changes what sort of mind becomes useful. So the old world keeps narrowing and refining them. A hand becomes more than a grasping tool because it must shape. A face becomes more than an eating surface because it must signal. Attention becomes more than awareness because it must anticipate. Even care, that fragile and easily sentimentalized human trait, becomes practical. To tend the injured may preserve a source of knowledge. To help transport a child may preserve future adulthood. To tolerate the slow and weak may retain memory of routes and seasons no one else holds fully. These things do not need moral philosophy behind them. They only need repeated conditions in which cooperation pays. Still, life remains close to failure. A sudden storm can erase tracks and scatter a hunt. A fall can open bone. A contaminated carcass can sicken several at once. Fire can be lost between camps. Rain can make the night cruel. A coastline once rich with food can become inaccessible. Grassland can harden into dust. Forest can thicken into danger. Against that scale of uncertainty, humans are not yet transformed, only tested. But the testing is relentless. and over time relentless testing alters what persists. This is the world just before the deeper break in the story. Not a golden age, not a primitive innocence, not a noble beginning. It is a world of repeated strain in which small groups of humans live because they manage somehow to hold more in common than the immediate present. They are under pressure from climate, from animals, from geography, from hunger from one another, and perhaps most of all from the impossible demands of being a fragile, slow-maturing, socially dependent species in an unforgiving world. They do not know they are approaching a threshold. They only know that survival keeps asking more of them than it once did, and little by little across distances too large for any one life to perceive they begin to answer. Then somewhere in that immense span of prehistory the pattern tightens. The pressure that has been shaping human lives for ages stops feeling like background and begins to act like a threshold. Not a single sunrise, not one thunderclap heard across continents, not one miraculous generation in which the old human world simply becomes the new one. Deep time is rarely so theatrical, and yet when the evidence is laid out across hundreds of thousands of years, there comes a point when later humans begin to look as though they are carrying something earlier humans do not carry in quite the same way. Their tools become more varied. Their movement through landscapes becomes more deliberate. Their use of difficult environments becomes more confident. Their traces begin to imply not just adaptation, but a different kind of awareness inside adaptation. Something has happened once in the long history of our kind and humans, after it not arranged in quite the old pattern anymore. The difficulty is that this great turning point does not arrive with a label. No layer of sediment says precisely here the species crossed into a new mode of being. What survives are fragments. A skull with a shape closer to the familiar, a toolkit more refined than those below it, a coastline used more intensively than before, pigment that seems to exceed immediate utility, signs of repeated occupation in places once visited only lightly or not at all. The record is patchy, regional, and deeply unfair. Africa, where the deepest roots of our species lie, contains crucial evidence, but preservation varies wildly. Shorelines that may have nourished decisive changes are now drowned. Inland sites can preserve one kind of life while erasing another. Scholars still debate the timing pace and even meaning of the change because no single line of evidence fully accounts for it. But few serious observers deny that a threshold exists. One way to see it is through instability itself. For long stretches of the Pleistocene climate swing hard. Wet phases open green corridors across lands now harsh and dry. Cold phases rearrange coasts, rivers, winds, and migration routes. In Africa, especially environmental mosaics appear and disappear, grassland beside woodland lakes filling and vanishing river systems connecting and then breaking apart. These are not just inconveniences. They create worlds in which a population must either remain highly flexible or disappear into the larger silence of extinction. Some scientists argue that this repeated ecological volatility is not merely a stressor, but the engine of change itself. The theory is not fringe, and it fits part of the evidence well. A species facing repeated shifts in habitat, prey, water access and competition may be pushed toward broader diets, greater mobility, more social dependence and finer-grained learning. In that view, the shock is not one disaster, but the long accumulation of unpredictability until a new kind of human becomes adaptive. But there may also have been narrower bottlenecks episodes in which human populations shrink to dangerous thinness. Genetics suggests that at certain points in the deep past, the ancestors of later humans likely passed through reduced population sizes, though the scale and timing remain debated, and the evidence must be handled carefully. What matters is not the fantasy of one lone surviving tribe, but the possibility that severe contraction intensifies selection and makes social knowledge even more precious. When populations thin, every death matters more. Every alliance matters more. Every remembered root edible species and reliable shelter matters more. A harsh interval can turn memory into inheritance. It can make behavior itself a survival organ. There is another possibility too, and it is less visible but perhaps more profound. The turning point may involve not just surviving the world differently, but perceiving it differently. That does not require magic nor a sudden birth of intelligence in a creature that was previously dull. Earlier humans are already intelligent, already capable, already adaptive. The difference may lie instead in degree layering and recursive depth, a mind that can hold longer chains of cause and effect, model absent things more vividly, track others' intentions more flexibly, and store social knowledge across greater spans of time, begins to live in a world thicker than the one around it. It is still the same grassland, the same cave mouth, the same herd crossing the same river bank, but it is now also a place of remembered seasons, anticipated shortages, inherited warnings, and shared plans. The landscape acquires an invisible dimension. This is why the evidence for the shift can feel both obvious and elusive. Tools alone do not explain it because tools are downstream of thought and tradition. Anatomy alone does not explain it because skull shape cannot reveal the full interior life of a species. Migration alone does not explain it because movement can come from desperation as much as ingenuity. Even symbolic traces where they appear may not mean what later humans want them to mean. A piece of ochre with wear marks might indicate body decoration, hide processing, or something else entirely. A pierced shell might be ornament marker or accident of preservation misread by hopeful eyes. The evidence remains incomplete, and yet taken together the clues point toward a transformation in how humans connect perception, learning, cooperation, and continuity. If one had to imagine the turning point not as a date but as an experience, it might look something like this. A group is moving through a landscape that no longer behaves as expected. Water that should be there is absent. Herds arrive late or not at all. The young are harder to carry because the journey is longer. Predators concentrate at the remaining reliable places. Nearby groups become more threatening because scarcity sharpens every encounter. Under these conditions, survival depends less on individual prowess and more on the ability to improvise collectively. Someone remembers a distant place visited years earlier. Someone recognizes stone of a kind worth carrying. Someone keeps embers alive through bad weather. Someone knows which season a shoreline becomes rich enough to justify the risk. Someone interprets tracks not just as presence, but as timing. The group that can link these fragments into action survives more often than the group that cannot. That sounds simple, but it changes everything. It means fitness is increasingly tied to social intelligence, memory depth, teaching, and trust under stress. It means the most useful human trait may not be strength, but the capacity to maintain shared patterns across individuals and generations. In such a world, minds are no longer merely reacting to immediate stimuli. They are managing invisible structures, expectation, instruction, obligation, sequence, deferred reward. This is not civilization, but it is no longer the old ecological improvisation alone. It is the beginning of humans living inside cultural scaffolding thick enough to alter evolution itself. Some of the most striking evidence for this threshold lies in expansion into difficult environments. Earlier humans are already adaptable, but later Homo sapiens begin to show a capacity to occupy, revisit, and exploit a wider range of habitats with unusual persistence. Coasts become more important in some regions. Arid zones, forests, uplands, and seasonal margins are negotiated with increasing confidence. This does not happen everywhere at once, and the record varies greatly, but what survives suggests a species less bound to one narrow niche. That widening of ecological range may reflect technological improvement, yes, but also planning depth. A dangerous coast is useful only if one can time the tide's coordinate collection process, what is gathered, and transmit those skills reliably. A seasonal landscape is livable only if absence is understood as temporary rather than final. A dry corridor is crossable only if its sequence of risks is remembered or discovered and then retained. The turning point then may be best understood as a change in the relationship between humans and uncertainty. Earlier humans endure uncertainty. Later humans begin imperfectly to organize against it. They stock memory. They shape space. They build routines around fragile predictability. They make use of things not immediately present, future hunger, distant water, the habits of prey, not currently in sight, the knowledge of people now dead but not forgotten. In that sense, the shock in deep time is not merely environmental or anatomical, it is temporal. Humans begin to live farther ahead of the moment than before, and once that begins, it does not truly go back. There are losses, collapses, local extinctions, abandoned traditions, and severe contractions still to come. Entire populations vanish. Techniques disappear. Landscapes erase what seemed established. But the species that emerges from this threshold carries a deeper dependency on transmitted knowledge than any earlier human form seems to show at the same scale. That is the irreversible part. Humans afterward are not simply clever animals in harsh environments. They are creatures increasingly made by what they inherit socially, as much as by what they inherit biologically. Of course, no single explanation fully accounts for why this happens when it does. Climate instability is persuasive but not sufficient on its own. Anatomical changes matter, but bones do not think. Language is often invoked, and with good reason, yet language leaves no direct fossil trail. Diet may contribute, especially if marine foods, cooking, or broader nutrient access support expensive brains and childhood development, but diet alone does not create collective memory. Social complexity explains much, though it too may be effect as much as cause. The most careful view is probably the least satisfying to anyone who wants one dramatic answer. Several developments likely converge. Environmental stress increases the premium on flexibility. Flexible groups favor memory and coordination. Better coordination favors teaching and perhaps richer communication. Richer communication favors more complex planning. Complex planning expands. Habitat use deepens social roles and strengthens cumulative culture. Once that loop intensifies, a different kind of human world begins to exist. What is striking is how quiet the turning point must have felt from inside it. No one living through it would know they stood near one of the most consequential thresholds in the history of the species. They would know only that some groups seemed better at surviving bad years. Some people seemed better at reading others. Some camps held together more effectively. Some places yielded more because they were approached with remembered skill. Some children lived who otherwise would not. Some journeys succeeded that should have failed. History, when it first changes direction, rarely announces itself. It does so in survival rates, in repeated choices, in the subtle advantage of one way of being over another. So this is the shock in deep time, not simply that the world becomes harsher, though it often does, and not simply that humans become smarter, because that word is too blunt to capture what matters. It is that a threshold is crossed in which human life begins to depend more fully on invisible structures shared across minds. After that, the species is still made of flesh, fear, hunger, and bone. It still bleeds, still starves, still dies under open sky. But it is different. It carries more of its world inside itself. And once that happens, the future of humanity no longer belongs only to climate and anatomy. It belongs increasingly to memory. Memory is where the change becomes visible, even if memory itself does not fossilize. Bone preserves, stone preserves, burned earth preserves if it is fortunate enough to lie undisturbed. But the decisive shift may live in what none of those things can fully hold: the widening distance between what a human body experiences and what a human mind can retain, recombine, and pass on. Earlier humans remember too, of course. They must. No creature survives a variable world without memory. But after the turning point, memory seems to become denser, more social, more layered with inference. It is no longer only the recollection of where water stood last season, or which ravine holds game in the cold months. It begins to include relationships between events, patterns across years, obligations within groups, and perhaps even stories that outlast the first-hand witness. That matters because memory changes the body. Not in the crude sense of altering flesh overnight, but in the slower evolutionary sense that bodies begin to serve minds, organized around longer chains of dependence. A hand shaped for precision becomes more useful in a species that does not merely grasp but teaches technique. Eyes that track subtle cues become more useful in a species that depends on reading intention, fear status, and attention in others. A face capable of fine expression becomes more valuable when coordination matters beyond immediate panic. Human anatomy had already been moving for a long time toward dexterity, endurance, and social signaling. What changes after the threshold may be the weight these traits carry. The body is no longer just surviving an environment. It is supporting a social system thick with invisible demands. Minds too begin to pay a price for this expansion. Greater awareness is not a clean blessing. To anticipate is to worry. To remember loss is to suffer it more than once. To recognize intention in others is to gain cooperation, but also suspicion, resentment, hierarchy, and shame. A species that becomes better at holding the future in mind also becomes harder to settle fully into the present. This is one of the quieter possibilities in human evolution, and one that the archaeological record can only approach indirectly. The very capacities that make humans different afterward may also make them more burdened. Scholars still debate how far back complex emotional and social cognition truly extends, because behavior leaves indirect traces at best. But what survives in the record suggests that later humans are carrying not just better tools, but heavier inner lives. Consider what it means for a group when memory is no longer stored only in repeated movement, but in individuals who can preserve and communicate nuance. An older member is no longer simply one more body moving slower than the rest. Such a person may embody a map of absences and returns, a failed crossing from years earlier, a poisonous plant mistaken once for a safe one, a wet season route that becomes a death trap in dry months, the behavior of animals after lightning fire, the smell of water before it appears. This kind of memory gives age a new function. It makes survival less strictly a matter of immediate strength, and more a matter of distributed cognition. One body recalls, another carries, another notices, another teaches. The group begins to operate less like a temporary cluster of individuals and more like a living archive. This has consequences for children as well. Long human childhood, once mostly a burden under pressure, starts to become an advantage of unusual depth. A child who remains dependent for years is also a child who can absorb vast amounts of learned behavior, social patterning, vocal nuance, material skill, and environmental understanding. The cost remains severe. Feeding, carrying, and protecting the young are still dangerous undertakings in a harsh world. But if what the child acquires is no longer just basic competence, but a whole inherited structure of practice, then prolonged immaturity becomes central to what the species is. Human beings afterward are not merely born and grown. They are installed slowly into a system. That installation likely includes imitation of remarkable precision. Other animals learn socially, sometimes impressively so, but humans appear to cross into a form of cultural dependence that becomes cumulative. A technique is not just repeated. It is refined, corrected, and stabilized. A tool shape persists not because stone demands it, but because a group comes to prefer it and can reproduce the pattern across time. A route is remembered not only by retracing it, but by embedding it in shared expectation. A fire is not merely found or borrowed from nature, but managed, protected, transported, and perhaps eventually understood as something that can organize life around itself. No single explanation fully accounts for this shift. Yet the pattern points toward a mind that is becoming increasingly receptive to instruction and increasingly unable to thrive without it. The body in such a species must endure more than hunger and weather. It must endure each other. Social living becomes thicker after the threshold. Cooperation deepens, but so do dependence and tension. A group that relies on distributed memory and coordinated action cannot tolerate indifference in the way looser associations might. Attention must be paid. Signals must be interpreted. Roles, however informal, begin to matter. Someone is better at finding stone. Someone is more reliable around fire. Someone watches children with unusual patience. Someone reads tracks. Someone calms conflict. Someone frightens easily and notices danger before others do. Variation that once sat at the edges of survival now begins to acquire social use. Human groups become less interchangeable internally. They begin to differentiate by skill, temperament, and remembered competence. This is one of the surprising details hidden in the story of human change. What evolves may not be one superior trait, but a greater ability to make use of different kinds of minds within one group. A cautious individual can be valuable. So can a bold one in the right context. A person more attuned to social fracture may preserve cohesion. A person more curious about unfamiliar terrain may find new routes. Later human societies will turn such variation into elaborate hierarchies and identities, but the deep root may lie here when survival starts to reward not just individual capability, but the integration of diverse capabilities. The evidence remains incomplete, as it must, because stone tools do not record personality. But the logic of increasingly complex cooperation strongly suggests that temperamental diversity becomes an asset rather than mere noise. Endurance too changes meaning. Human bodies had already become suited to long-distance movement before this later threshold, with upright gait, efficient walking, and the remarkable ability to dissipate heat through sweating. But physical endurance after the turning point seems to connect more closely to mental endurance. The ability to sustain plans, return to productive places, seasonally carry unfinished intentions over time, and persist through scarcity because memory supports delayed reward. This is not simply toughness. Many animals are tough. It is a form of temporal discipline, however unconscious. To travel toward a place not because it is visible, but because it ought to yield resources at a certain time of year is already a subtle triumph of mind over immediate stimulus. To do it collectively is something larger. There may also be changes in how humans model other minds. A group living under chronic pressure gains a great deal from anticipating not just the movement of prey, but the likely choices of companions. Who is likely to panic? Who can be trusted with fire? Who shares food? Who strays? Who notices? Who lies if deception is already emerging in more flexible forms? This social prediction is expensive work. It places demands on attention, emotion, and memory that are different from those required by simple group living. Yet once social worlds deepen, such prediction becomes unavoidable. A more socially complex human is not merely more cooperative. Such a human is also more entangled. An entanglement reaches beyond the living. At some point, memory begins to include the dead in a new way. This does not necessarily mean formal ritual at first, nor anything like later religion. It may mean the practical persistence of absent teachers in the minds of those who survive them. A hunting technique remains the way it is done because someone once showed it. A place remains avoided because someone once died there. A certain stone source remains favoured because it worked in the past. Memory turns individuals into patterns that outlast their bodies. That may be one of the most consequential things that ever happens to humans. Once the dead continue influencing the living through transmitted structure, culture acquires depth beyond any single lifetime. The fossil record cannot tell us the first moment this occurs, and scholars still debate how to interpret early traces of care burial or repeated symbolic behaviour. Some findings are tantalizing but ambiguous. Some are convincing in one region and absent in another. Preservation distorts everything, but the broader pattern remains compelling after the threshold. Humans increasingly inhabit worlds organized by accumulated memory rather than immediate ecology alone. Landscapes are no longer only places of resources and threats, they are also places of precedent. This makes human minds both stronger and more fragile. Stronger because they can carry information that transforms survival. Fragile because so much now depends on successful transmission. A child not taught correctly may misread a season. A route forgotten may become fatal. A conflict unresolved may dissolve a group whose knowledge cannot be replaced quickly. Once humans become dependent on cumulative memory, ignorance itself becomes dangerous in a new way. Not the simple ignorance of an individual creature born without instinct for one plant or another, but the deeper ignorance of cultural interruption. When transmission fails, the species loses more than one body's experience. It loses a working piece of itself. So the bodies, minds, and memory of humans begin to bind together differently after the change. Flesh still matters, hunger still matters, cold still matters. But increasingly what determines survival is not the isolated organism meeting the world alone. It is the organism as part of a system of recalled patterns, shared roles, and inherited expectations. Humans become the species that stores part of its survival outside the genome but inside the group. That is the real transformation. Not a cleaner brain in a larger skull, not a mythic awakening, not a miracle in a cave. It is the gradual construction of a human way of being, in which the mind is never fully singular and the body is never enough by itself. That is why the turning point never quite goes away. Every later human achievement, from migration to agriculture to writing to empire, still rests on this older foundation. Long before records, humans have already become creatures whose survival depends on remembering more than one lifetime can contain. And from that moment on, every child enters not just a landscape but an inheritance. The stones notice first, or rather they are the first things that later survive well enough to let us notice. Human thought does not harden into fossils, but choices do. A hand reaches for one kind of raw material instead of another. A flake is struck not just to produce an edge, but to produce a particular edge of a predictable shape. A core is prepared in advance, worked with a sequence already held in mind before the first blow falls. These are small acts when seen alone. In aggregate across centuries and sites scattered over enormous distances, they begin to look like evidence that human behavior is no longer merely immediate. It is structured. It is anticipatory. It is guided by patterns that outlive any one occasion. Older tool traditions had skill in them too, and it is important not to flatten the deep past into a crude contrast between simple ancestors and sophisticated descendants. Acheulean hand axes, for example, can be elegant, standardized, and astonishingly persistent. Earlier humans are fully capable of competence learning and innovation, but after the turning point, something subtle begins to intensify. Toolkits become more varied. Production becomes more staged. Materials are sometimes carried farther. Particular forms recur in ways that imply teaching preference and memory, rather than sheer accident. What survives in the record suggests not just better stoneworking, but more deliberate organization of effort. The mind behind the tool appears to be thinking ahead in longer chains. This is especially visible in prepared core techniques where stone is shaped in advance, so that later flakes can be struck with more control. Such methods require planning before immediate reward. The maker must see not just what the stone is, but what it can become after several steps that have not yet happened. That matters because it reveals a relationship to the future. A creature reacting only to the present can still use a sharp edge. A creature planning sequences can create a system. Scholars still debate how directly these technological shifts map onto cognition, because technique can spread culturally, without requiring every individual to reinvent its logic, and the evidence remains incomplete. Still, no serious reading of the record can miss the pattern. Stone begins to preserve a thicker kind of intention. The same is true of raw material itself. In some sites, people carry good quality stone across longer distances than sheer convenience would demand. This is a quiet but consequential clue. It suggests foresight because carrying heavy material only makes sense if future need is expected. It suggests selectivity because not all stone is equal, and some kinds are worth the effort. It may even suggest social exchange or repeated movement across known routes, though those interpretations must remain cautious unless supported by broader context. Even so, the broad implication stands. Humans are no longer only using what lies immediately underfoot. They are beginning to stock possibility, and then there are places where tools appear in patterned clusters, as though tasks are no longer dissolving into the landscape the moment they are done. A butchery spot, a recurrent napping area, a place where fire and cutting, scraping and breaking return again and again in recognizable combinations. This matters because repeated use creates memory in the ground. A site becomes more than a temporary stop. It becomes a place in a network of places known for what can be done there. Some caves show layered occupations, some open-air sites reveal recurring activity, and some localities combine resources in ways that make repeated return likely. No single explanation fully accounts for every pattern, because preservation is uneven, and the same looking traces can arise from different behaviors. But the broader movement is unmistakable. Humans begin to treat landscapes less as random stretches to survive through, and more as structured environments full of usable nodes. Bones tell part of the same story. Cut marks, percussion fractures, burning traces transport patterns. All of these reveal changing relationships to prey and carcasses. In some places, the evidence suggests selective transport of valuable parts, rather than simple opportunistic feeding where an animal fell. That implies planning around energy and mobility. Marrow extraction becomes more systematic. Carcass processing appears more organized. The timing of access, whether humans are primary hunters or later scavengers, varies by context and remains debated in many cases. But either way, the behavioral signal is interesting. Humans are increasingly efficient at turning animal death into durable survival. They do not merely seize calories, they organize them. One of the lesser-known details hidden in faunal remains is how often ancient humans seem willing to exploit not just the obvious large prey, but the smaller, less glamorous resources that demand patience and technical knowledge. Rabbits, tortoises, fish, birds, shellfish, and other lower-ranked foods in some ecosystems can become important, especially when conditions tighten or when groups learn to exploit them reliably. This expansion of diet breadth is easy to overlook because later imagination prefers dramatic mammoth hunts and spear-bearing silhouettes against sunsets. But the archaeological signal often points towards something more interesting: flexibility. A species willing to broaden its menu under pressure is a species organizing itself against uncertainty. Stone and bone together begin to show that change. Then there are the traces that lie just at the edge of certainty, the ones that tempt interpretation, because they seem to exceed strict necessity. Pigments are among the most famous. Pieces of ochre with grinding facets, scraping marks, or wear that implies deliberate handling turn up in some Middle Stone Age contexts and beyond. It is possible that some pigments have practical uses: hide processing adhesives, insect deterrent, surface treatment. It is also possible that at least some are used for marking bodies, objects, or spaces. The evidence remains incomplete, and one must be careful not to project modern symbolic hunger onto every red-stained fragment. Yet the recurrence is hard to ignore. Colour is being carried, modified, and preserved in ways that may indicate a human world beginning to care not only about function, but about appearance, identity, or meaning. There are also perforated shells, modified bones, and other small objects whose significance remains debated, but whose very existence suggests that people are increasingly attentive to materials beyond immediate survival. A shell brought inland is rarely just food refuse. A marked object may not prove art in the modern sense, but it may prove selection. Selection matters. To choose something because it stands out, because it can be worn, because it marks a person or a connection, is to live in a world where social signals have become important enough to carry. The old human universe of direct need is starting to acquire surface. Caves preserve some of the most haunting clues because they are both shelters and archives. Inside them, traces accumulate slowly: hearth residues, worked stone bones left by humans and carnivores in uneasy succession, layers of occupation separated by centuries or collapse. In certain caves, repeated return suggests that people know these interiors not simply as accidental refuge, but as dependable anchors in difficult landscapes. Light, smoke, shadow, acoustics, defensibility, moisture all become part of how humans choose and remember space. A cave is no longer only a hole in rock. It is a place with qualities, and those qualities can be known, taught, and revisited. Even footprints, when the rare conditions for preservation align, offer hints of changed behavior. A trail of individuals moving together, children among them, can reveal group composition at a moment too brief for most of prehistory to keep. Prints near water, along mud flats, or in volcanic ash remind us that ancient humans are not abstractions, but coordinated bodies moving through real terrain. They also suggest something else: travel as a shared practice rather than isolated wandering. A group on the move carries more than meat and infants. It carries information. Roots themselves become memory made visible in repeated feet. What is striking across all these categories is that the evidence does not point to one single invention. It points to accumulation, better sequence in toolmaking, greater selectivity in materials, wider diets, more consistent place use, increasing traces of pigments or portable objects, more patterned carcass processing. None of these alone proves a cognitive revolution, and scholars rightly resist dramatic slogans. but together they imply that humans are becoming more dependent on systems of learned behavior that can be stabilized across time. A stone tradition is not just a set of objects, it is memory distributed through hands. A recurring campsite is not just shelter, it is habit placed onto land. A carried pigment is not just matter, it is intention surviving transport. The most important thing buried in the stone, then, is not intelligence in the abstract. It is continuity. Continuity is what lets a flaking method persist beyond one skilled maker. Continuity is what lets a useful raw material source remain part of group behavior across generations. Continuity is what lets a place become known, a route become expected, a carcass processing routine become teachable. Once continuity deepens, humans cease being only adaptable in the moment. They become cumulative, and cumulative creatures leave a different archaeological signature. Their sites may not always be larger, but they are often more legible as systems. Their choices recur, their materials travel, their traces hint at instruction. By the time such patterns become visible in multiple regions and multiple categories of evidence, it is hard to deny that the species is operating differently. The change is not theatrical. It is not one dazzling object in a museum case. It is the slow emergence of pattern from noise. That is why stone matters so much in this story. Stone is patient. It keeps the rhythm of blows long after the hands are gone. It preserves the order of thought better than almost anything else in the deep record. And what it tells us imperfectly but insistently is that after a certain threshold, humans begin to organize action, in longer sequences carry useful possibilities forward, and embed learned structure into landscapes and materials. The evidence remains incomplete, many interpretations are contested, and no single artifact can bear the full weight of the argument. But the stones together make a strong case. Something fundamental has shifted. Human life is no longer just happening, it is being arranged. Fire had always been more than light even before humans fully understood what it was becoming. A flame at night pushes predators back, not because it makes anyone powerful, but because it alters the terms of approach. Teeth hesitate at the edge of brightness. Eyeshine holds still in the dark and then slips away. Smoke moves through insects and unsettles them. Warmth keeps the body from spending so much of itself against the cold. Meat changes over heat. Roots soften. Water can be made safer in ways early humans may not fully explain, only observe. Even before the deeper transformation in human life, fire is already useful. After the threshold, it begins to look like something larger, a tool that reorganizes time, space, diet, and social life all at once. That is why the evidence for fire matters so much, and also why it is so difficult. Burned sediment, charcoal flecks, reddened earth-heated stone concentrations of ash. These can reveal controlled use, but not always with clean certainty. Wildfire can mimic some signals. Later disturbance can scramble them. A burned patch inside a cave may or may not represent a deliberately maintained hearth. Scholars still debate some early claims of fire control for precisely this reason. The evidence remains incomplete and demands caution. Yet over time, especially in later Middle Stone Age and related contexts, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. Fire is not merely encountered, it is maintained, revisited, and eventually built into the ordinary structure of human life. Once that happens, human space changes. Before regular fire use, shelter is mostly defensive or opportunistic. A cave, a rock overhang, a windbreak of vegetation, the lee side of a ridge, these are places of temporary refuge. With fire, a place becomes habitable in a more active sense. Darkness can be pushed back. Cold can be negotiated. The center of a camp can be marked not only by where bodies collapse from exhaustion, but by where heat and attention gather. A hearth turns a patch of ground into a social anchor. Around it, tasks can continue later into the evening. Food can be processed. Tools can be repaired. Children can be kept close. Stories, if that word is not yet too advanced for the period, can begin to occupy the same space as survival. This is one of the quiet revolutions hidden inside ordinary ash. Fire extends the day. That sounds simple, but extending the day means extending coordination. More waking hours in shared light means more opportunity for teaching imitation planning, grooming conflict management and memory transfer. A technique can be demonstrated after sunset. A dangerous event from earlier in the day can be reviewed around a stable focal point. A child can watch adults work in a way impossible if darkness immediately dissolves group life into sleep and fear. No single explanation fully accounts for the human transformation, but fire almost certainly amplifies many of the traits that matter most: cooperation, patience, routine, and the thickening of social time. It also changes food in ways that may have consequences far beyond taste. Cooking makes many foods easier to chew and digest. It can reduce pathogens. It can unlock calories from otherwise marginal resources. Tough meat softens. Starchy tubers become more usable. Some toxins can be reduced through heat, though this varies greatly and cannot be assumed carelessly. The broader point is clear enough. Fire makes certain landscapes more edible. A species that cooks is no longer limited in quite the old way by what jaws, guts, and daylight alone can manage. Some researchers have argued that cooking plays a foundational role in human evolution by increasing energetic efficiency, though the timing and scale of its effects remain debated. Even where the strongest claims are contested, the practical significance is undeniable. Fire broadens the menu and lowers some of the bodily costs of survival. There is an understated but important human consequence here. If food takes less effort to chew and digest, if warmth reduces nighttime strain, if smoke deters some pests, if the camp's center becomes more stable, then survival no longer depends solely on constant motion and immediate reaction. A little more energy can be directed elsewhere, to infants, to the injured, to older members, to carrying embers, to maintaining tools, to remembering. It is not that fire creates compassion out of nowhere or transforms ancient humans into calm domestic beings. Camps can still be dangerous. Heat can burn. Smoke can choke. Fire can fail in wind or rain, but the controlled use of flame creates the first reliable human-made environment, one small circle of altered conditions inside a hostile world. This is why shelter begins to matter differently too. A place with fire is not just cover, it is infrastructure, however fragile. Caves become more than emergency refuge. They can become recurring bases. Open-air camps can be arranged with some logic around the hearth. The positioning of bodies tools refuse, and activity areas may begin to take on more order. Archaeologists sometimes infer such organization from artifact clusters, burned patches, faunal remains, and wear patterns, though the interpretations must remain cautious. Even so, what survives in the record suggests that people are increasingly shaping space rather than merely enduring it. A place to sleep, a place to work, a place to burn, a place to discard. These distinctions may be faint at first, but once humans begin making them regularly domestic, life has begun in a very deep sense. Fire also teaches discipline. It must be watched, fed, protected from weather, and managed so that it helps rather than destroys. Someone must tend embers. Someone must gather fuel, and not just any fuel, but fuel of the right kind, dry enough, near enough, worth carrying. These are not glamorous tasks, but they demand foresight and routine. A group that depends on fire becomes tied to chains of preparation. extending beyond immediate hunger or threat. Wood must be noticed before it is needed. Sparks must be preserved across movement. Camp choice must consider not only shelter and water, but burnable material. A creature able to do this consistently is already living ahead of the moment. There may be another effect as well, one harder to prove but difficult to ignore. Fire changes faces. In daylight, expression belongs to the whole body and the open landscape. In firelight, attention narrows. Eyes catch flicker. Small movements of the mouth and brow become more legible at close range. Silence thickens differently around a flame than under a bright sky. Human sociality may deepen in part because evening around fire creates a distinct emotional theatre, a stable centre, warm margins, time enough to observe others when the immediate work of movement and foraging has paused. Scholars still debate how much can responsibly be inferred here, because such intimate dynamics leave almost no direct trace. But what survives in the record suggests that hearths are not merely functional features. They are places where repeated proximity becomes normal. This repeated proximity would have consequences for children especially. Around fire, the young can remain near adult activity without being directly underfoot in the same way. They can see tools being repaired, food being prepared, gestures repeated, warnings embodied, routines demonstrated. Long human childhood, once purely costly under pressure, becomes even more valuable in a fire-centered world because teaching gains a dependable stage. This matters because cumulative culture depends not just on intelligence, but on repeated occasions for instruction. Fire helps create those occasions. It slows the dissolution of group life at dusk and turns survival into something more collectively rehearsed. There is also the possibility that fire reshapes fear itself, not erasing it certainly, but reorganizing it. Night without fire is open-ended. Every sound matters equally because almost nothing can be seen or controlled. Night with fire is still dangerous, but danger now has boundaries. The edge of a light becomes a meaningful line. Beyond it lies uncertainty. Within it lies a zone, however temporary, of negotiated order. Humans become a species increasingly dependent on making such zones. Later they will build houses, walls, shrines, villages, and cities. Here the hearth is the beginning of that impulse, a claim laid upon space, a refusal to remain entirely exposed. Some of the lesser-known evidence for the growing sophistication of fire use lies in heated stone technologies, adhesive production, or the thermal treatment of materials in later contexts. These developments do not appear everywhere at once, and many belong to later phases rather than the earliest threshold. Still they matter because they show humans moving from using fire as a found force to manipulating it as a process. That is an extraordinary shift. To understand that controlled heat can alter material properties is to begin reasoning about hidden transformation, not just visible flame. The evidence remains incomplete and regionally uneven, but the trajectory is unmistakable. Fire becomes more than companion, it becomes method, and method changes the species. A group with fire can settle the body more effectively, feed itself more broadly, defend itself more reliably, and teach itself more continuously. It can build familiarity into places that would otherwise remain merely tolerable. It can preserve not just warmth, but pattern. This is why fire belongs at the center of the story. Not because it arrives suddenly and explains everything, but because once it is woven deeply into life, humans are no longer interacting with the world on entirely natural terms. They are increasingly constructing conditions that suit them. That construction is still fragile. Rain can end it. Movement can interrupt it. Fuel can run short. A mistake can wound or kill. But fragility does not make the change small. On the contrary, it shows how much human life has begun to depend on tending systems that do not exist without care. Fire is one such system. Shelter increasingly becomes another. Together they signal that the human world after the threshold is not just better at surviving what exists. It is better at creating temporary order where none was given. So the ash-darkening ancient sediments means more than warmth on a cold night. It marks the slow birth of human interiority, in the physical sense the making of inside and outside center, and edge shared light, and surrounding dark. A flame in the old world is still a practical thing, still subject to accident and weather, still one tool among others. But over time it becomes the place where food changes, where nights lengthen, where children learn, where memory settles, and where a species increasingly unlike its predecessors gathers itself. Humans after this are still animals of open ground, river-crossing hunger, migration and fear. But they are also now creatures of the hearth, and that means they are beginning to live not only in nature but around an idea of home. Once survival begins to depend less on raw immediacy, and more on stored knowledge, shared routines, and managed space, the group itself changes shape. Not physically, at least not in any simple way, but in the logic of how it holds together. In earlier human worlds, cooperation is already necessary. No creature with such vulnerable young and such exposed bodies survives entirely alone. But after the deeper threshold, cooperation seems to become denser, more durable, and more structured by expectation. The band is no longer just a temporary cluster of individuals moving through the same danger. It becomes a system of obligations. That is a quiet shift, but one of the most important in the whole human story. The clearest sign of this is not a monument or a burial treasure. It is the long dependence of children and the increasing improbability that one mother, one father, or one pair of adults could reliably carry the entire burden alone in harsh and variable environments. Human offspring are difficult in a way that borders on evolutionary extravagance. They are born neurologically unfinished, physically helpless, and behaviorally needy for years. They require feeding, carrying, cleaning, guarding, soothing, teaching, and constant monitoring across a span of time that would be ruinous for a solitary strategy. This likely means that by the time humans cross into their more distinctive mode of life, child rearing has already become deeply collective. The evidence remains incomplete because care does not fossilize neatly, but no single explanation of human success makes sense without extensive cooperation around the young. That cooperation likely reaches beyond the biological parents in important ways. Older siblings matter. Grandmothers may matter enormously. Related adults of several kinds almost certainly matter. Even non-kin may sometimes matter if alliances are stable enough. Among anthropologists, alloparenting, the care of children by individuals other than the mother, is often treated as central to human life, and for good reason. It distributes cost. It increases vigilance. It allows mothers to forage, recover, or carry on other tasks essential to group survival. It also turns childhood into a social classroom rather than a private dependency. A child raised among multiple caregivers learns not just from one source, but from a crowd of examples. That is a powerful engine for transmitting behavior, temperament, and group expectations. This is where kinship begins to deepen into something more than blood proximity. Later human societies will formalize kinship into lineages, descent systems, marriage rules, inheritance patterns, and elaborate taboos. In the deep past, the structure is almost certainly looser and more fluid. But even fluid systems can carry strong social weight. Who shares food with whom? Who has claims over sleeping space near the hearth? Who carries which child when danger rises? Who mediates conflict? Who has authority in choosing routes? Who is deferred to in a lean season? None of these roles needs a formal title to matter. What survives in the record suggests that human groups become increasingly ordered by remembered relationships rather than mere proximity. Familiarity itself becomes infrastructure. This likely transforms mating and partnership as well, though here caution is essential. The deep past does not leave clean records of emotional bonds, sexual norms, or household structures. Scholars still debate the extent to which pair bonding, cooperative breeding, and broader kin-based networks dominate at different stages of human evolution, because the evidence must be inferred from anatomy, comparative primate behavior, energetics, and later ethnographic parallels. Still, some things are difficult to escape. A species with long childhoods, high maternal costs, and strong dependence on skill transmission has much to gain from stable cooperation between adults. That cooperation need not always resemble later marriage, and it certainly does not require romantic idealization. It may be practical, temporary, serial, or embedded in wider kin structures. But after the turning point, the human group increasingly rewards relationships that persist long enough to hold fragile lives together. Food sharing is one of the most revealing pieces of this puzzle. To share regularly is to do something evolutionarily risky. It means giving calories to others who might in a narrow sense consume what could have sustained oneself. Yet in a world of uneven success, sharing can stabilize the group. A large carcass may be impossible to consume before spoilage anyway. A shoreline harvest may be abundant one day and absent the next. Plant foods may be predictable in one season and meagre in another. When returns vary sharply, pooling helps. It smooths luck. It protects children. It keeps injured or unlucky adults alive long enough to contribute later. This does not require moral generosity in the later sense. It only requires repeated conditions under which sharing increases group resilience. Over time, such behavior can become expected rather than exceptional. Expected sharing, though, creates a social world far more complicated than simple mutual aid. Once food moves through relationships, memory begins keeping score. Who shares fairly? Who hoards? Who takes and fails to reciprocate? Who can be trusted in scarcity? Who uses power, charm, or intimidation to redirect resources? These are not trivial matters. They are the beginnings of reputation. A group depending on long-term cooperation cannot function on instinct alone. It must track behavior across time. This makes social intelligence even more valuable. Humans are no longer only reading tracks in mud or weather in the sky. They are reading each other, and that may be among the greatest evolutionary escalations of all. Conflict naturally does not disappear in such a world. In fact, denser social life probably creates more occasions for it. Jealousy, unequal effort, competing preferences, sexual rivalry, stress under hunger, disputes over routes or resting places, frustration with dependent young, resentment of authority. These things do not need agriculture or cities to exist. They are available anywhere humans must rely on one another more than is comfortable. What changes after the threshold may be not the existence of conflict, but the increasing need to contain it. A fractured group can lose memory, labor, child protection, fire maintenance, and carrying capacity all at once. That makes social repair a survival skill. Someone must calm, redirect, reconcile, or at least delay breakdown. The archaeological record cannot name such people, but groups that fail too often at this kind of repair may simply vanish from history. This in turn gives unusual value to emotional regulation. Not perfect calm, which no human lineage ever possessed, but the ability to suppress immediate impulse in favor of collective continuity. A person who can endure insult, share under stress, accept a delay, or remain attentive to group signals may preserve more than personal standing. Such a person may preserve the group's functionality. This is one of the hidden paradoxes of human evolution traits often coded later, as moral may first have mattered because they were practical. Patience protects infants. Reliability protects food sharing. Tolerance protects transmission. Care protects memory. In the old world, after the turning point, social virtue may begin as survival technology. There is a lesser known but revealing aspect to this as well. The role of older individuals in human groups may become increasingly significant once collective memory deepens. In many animal species, age brings weakness and declining reproductive value. In humans, age can also bring accumulated environmental knowledge, familiarity with people, conflict history, seasonal timing, and procedural skill. This does not mean every older person survives long, nor that prehistoric groups are full of elderly sages. Life remains hard. Injury, infection, and scarcity still cut many lives short. But when an older individual does survive, the benefits to the group may be substantial enough that care becomes worthwhile in strictly adaptive terms. Tooth wear, healed fractures, and long-term survival after serious injury in some ancient remains hint at care that exceeds immediate utility. Scholars debate individual cases, but the broad implication is hard to dismiss. Later humans seem increasingly willing, and perhaps increasingly able to preserve lives that still hold value beyond raw strength. This may be the real new shape of human groups. Not simply larger numbers, though some populations may indeed expand under favorable conditions, but greater functional density inside the group. More roles, more remembered expectations, more interdependence between different ages, temperaments, and competencies. The band becomes less like a survival cluster and more like an organism made of persons. One gathers fuel, one remembers routes, one notices danger, one manages children, one shapes stone, one interprets mood, one absorbs tension, one keeps embers alive. No one does only one thing, of course, but the distribution itself matters. Human success increasingly lies in combining partial strengths. This has consequences for identity too. A person begins to matter not solely as a reproductive body or a pair of useful hands, but as a bearer of specific value within the social fabric. That fabric is still fragile. Death can tear it. A bad season can scatter it. Rival groups can absorb or replace it. But the principle has begun to exist. Humans survive not just by living together, but by becoming increasingly difficult to separate from one another without loss of function. That is a very different condition from the looser arrangements of earlier times. It also helps explain why later human expansions are so consequential. A group built on distributed skill and collective child-rearing can move knowledge farther. It can recover more effectively from partial losses. It can integrate newcomers or split while retaining some continuity. It can survive not because every individual is extraordinary, but because the group stores enough overlap and enough specialization to absorb shocks. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and much remains debated, especially when projecting social structures back into the deep past. But the general trajectory is compelling. Humans after the threshold are increasingly social in a way that is not optional. Their bodies, memories, and futures are knotted together, and once that knot tightens, a new kind of inheritance begins. Not just genes, not just tools, not just places known and revisited, but the actual shape of living together. Children do not merely learn how to find food. They learn how a human group behaves when someone is injured, when food is scarce, when a decision must be made, when fire needs tending, when a child cries, when someone grows old, when conflict threatens to split the night. The species starts passing on not only techniques but social worlds. That is when survival ceases to be only an encounter between a body and the landscape. It becomes an encounter between a culture and uncertainty. However thin that culture still is by later standards, however vulnerable to interruption, however impossible to reconstruct in full detail, it has become real enough to alter the fate of the species. Humans are different after this because they do not face the world one by one anymore. They face it braided together. Once human groups become dense enough to carry memory collectively, another layer begins to form above survival itself. It is easy from the safety of the present to imagine symbolic thought as a luxury that appears only after food, shelter, and cooperation are secure. But the deep past suggests something more entangled. Meaning is not a decorative addition to human life. It may become one of the ways human life stabilizes itself under pressure. Fear needs shape. Loss needs continuity. Dangerous landscapes need to be remembered not just as coordinates but as stories. A species increasingly dependent on transmitted knowledge and social cohesion has much to gain from minds that can attach memory to image, gesture, sound, and shared significance. This does not mean that one day humans suddenly invent religion, art, or myth in the later sense. Such ideas arrive piecemeal unevenly, and in forms the archaeological record can only glimpse. A piece of ochre used repeatedly a shell chosen, and carried an unusual arrangement of remains, a pattern incised into bone or stone, a place revisited for reasons that seem to exceed immediate utility. None of these can bear the full weight of modern interpretation by themselves. Scholars still debate many of the earliest cases, and rightly so. The evidence remains incomplete, but taken together these traces suggest that humans are increasingly acting as though some things matter beyond direct use. That is a profound change. Fear is one of the likely engines of this process. In the older world, fear is immediate and bodily. Something moves in the grass, something waits by water, a storm builds too quickly, a child vanishes from sight. But once memory deepens, fear begins to stretch. It can attach itself to places, seasons, animals, absences, and repeated events. A ravine becomes more than a route. It becomes the place where someone died. A certain wind may mean failing rains. A distant hillside may carry the memory of a dangerous encounter years earlier. Human beings start living not just among objects and threats, but among charged locations in a remembered world. The landscape becomes moralized in a very early sense, not necessarily with good and evil, but with significance. That significance can be socially useful. A warning told as a plain instruction may be forgotten. A warning bound to a striking image repeated in ritualized form or attached to a place with emotional force may endure. The human mind appears particularly suited to remember what is vivid, unusual, and shared. This may be one reason symbolic behavior gains survival value. A red-marked object, a repeated gesture, a rhythm of sound, a taboo around a site. All of these can work as memory technology long before writing and long before formal doctrine. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of symbolic behavior, but its practical benefits in a species dependent on cumulative culture are hard to ignore. Meaning can preserve information. The same may be true of mourning. Once humans live in denser social worlds, death changes character. It is not only the disappearance of a body, it is the interruption of roles, knowledge, habits, and expectations. The dead remain present in the behavior of the living because what they knew still matters, what they did still shapes routines, and what they meant to others does not vanish at burial or abandonment. At some point, this persistence of the absent may begin to acquire more formal expression. The archaeological hints are uneven and often controversial. Some burials once claimed as ritual are now read more cautiously. Some evidence of body treatment may have practical causes. Yet there are enough cases of apparent care for the dead, deliberate placement, pigment association, or repeated attention to remains that the question cannot be ignored. Humans seem increasingly unwilling to treat death as mere disposal. That reluctance may not begin from theology. It may begin from social depth. A group that depends on collective memory will feel the absence of certain individuals more sharply. A child may ask where someone has gone. A tool may still be used the way a dead person taught it. A route may still be travelled because a dead person once remembered it. In such conditions, the line between memory and presence becomes strangely thin. The dead are gone, but they continue structuring life. That is fertile ground for symbolic thought, for ritual gesture, perhaps, eventually for something like ancestral imagination. The evidence remains incomplete, and one must resist turning every prehistoric burial into proof of rich spiritual systems. But what survives in the record suggests that death itself is increasingly being experienced in culturally mediated ways. The role of story, though invisible archaeologically, may be central here. A story is more than entertainment. It binds sequence, causation, emotion, and memory into a form that can travel through minds. It can explain why a place matters, why a behavior is required, why a danger recurs, why a group belongs together, why the young must listen, why the absent still count. We do not know when fully narrative language emerges, and scholars still debate how rapidly symbolic and linguistic complexity develop. But once humans are capable of communicating beyond immediate commands and signals, story becomes almost inevitable. It is too useful not to appear. It teaches without demonstration, preserves without direct experience, and carries emotion in ways dry instruction cannot. There is another possibility too, one less comfortable but deeply human. Symbolic thought may intensify not only cohesion but anxiety. A creature that can imagine unseen causes, hidden intentions, remembered disasters and possible futures can also become vulnerable to dread that exceeds the present. A strange noise in the dark is no longer only a noise. It may become a sign. An illness is no longer only bodily misfortune. It may become attached to ideas of violation, danger, or unseen order. The same mind that can preserve life-saving information through symbolism can also create fear that echoes beyond evidence. This dual quality may be ancient. Meaning helps humans endure the world, but it also enlarges the world into something harder to settle. And yet the benefits are enormous. Shared meaning can glue groups together across hardship. A repeated practice around the hearth, a gesture before entering a dangerous place, a rule about who handles the dead, a colour associated with identity, or transition, a rhythmic sound that synchronizes bodies and attention. These things do not merely decorate life. They create coordination at scales that raw instinct cannot sustain. They help strangers become less strange. They help children become members rather than dependents. They help grief become bearable enough not to shatter the group. They help fear become memorable enough to teach with. This is why the earlier symbolic traces, however ambiguous individually, matter so much collectively. Ochre is not just a red mineral if it is selected, processed, carried, and used repeatedly in contexts not fully explained by utility alone. Shells are not just shellfish residue if they are perforated, transported inland, and worn. Markings are not just scratches if they repeat in patterned ways that suggest intent beyond accident. Cave spaces are not just shelters if certain chambers are entered or marked in ways disconnected from ordinary domestic tasks. The evidence remains uneven across regions and dates, and scholars still debate which traces truly indicate symbolic behavior rather than practical action misread. But the accumulation of such evidence strongly suggests that later humans inhabit increasingly meaningful worlds. What changes ultimately is that fear no longer belongs only to the body and memory no longer belongs only to skill. Both begin to move into the realm of shared representation. A dangerous animal may become not just prey or predator, but a figure in the group's understanding of danger. A place of water may become not just a stop but a node in inherited thought. A colour may become not just matter, but marker. Human beings after the turning point seem to carry around mental landscapes layered over the physical one. That invisible doubling of the world may be one of the most consequential things our species ever does. It also begins to create continuity across absence. A child can learn of a place never seen. A youth can avoid a danger not personally encountered. A group can remember a seasonal pattern through a lean interval. A dead person's influence can persist through ritualized behavior. This is culture operating not simply as habit, but as symbolic storage. Once that exists, human societies become much harder to reduce to ecological reflex. They are still shaped by climate-prey geography and risk, but they now mediate those pressures through meanings that have lives of their own. No single explanation fully accounts for how quickly or how uniformly this develops. Some populations may have symbolic systems that leave little or no trace. Some traces we do find may be overinterpreted. Some forms of meaning may remain practical and local, rather than grand or transcendent. The cautious view is best, but caution does not erase the larger pattern. At some point, humans begin to live in worlds made not only of matter and need, but of signs. And signs are powerful because they let a species coordinate around things that are not immediately present. They allow loyalty to persist beyond hunger, warning to outlast the witness grief to become structure rather than collapse, and identity to survive movement across dangerous ground. This is the deeper significance of fear story and meaning in the human past. They are not soft additions to a hard life. They are among the mechanisms by which hard life becomes survivable on human terms. So by now the species has crossed well beyond the old condition. It still bleeds and starves. It still huddles by fire and fears the dark. But it has also begun to fill that dark with remembered forms, to mark the body and the world with significance, and to carry invisible worlds alongside the visible one. After that, humans are never simply reacting creatures again. They are interpretive creatures, and that changes everything that follows. They are never alone in this world, not really. Even when one lineage seems to dominate the surviving record for a while, the deeper truth of prehistory is more crowded and more uncertain than older textbook narratives once implied. For long stretches of time, multiple humankinds share the planet in overlapping adjacent or intermittently connected ranges. Some are close relatives, some are more distant branches. Some leave behind skeletons robust enough to recognize at a glance. Others survive only in a jaw, a few teeth, a fragment of finger bone, or a genetic echo carried invisibly into later populations. The human past is not a single torch passed neatly from one hand to another. It is a field of fires, some bright, some brief, some merging, some going out. That matters because the great change in human behavior does not happen in an empty arena. Whatever made later humans different after that one long threshold did not make them the only humans alive. In Eurasia, Neanderthals endure for an astonishing span of time highly capable, regionally adapted cold-season survivors with bodies shaped by difficult climates and lives that are anything but primitive in the lazy old sense. Farther east, elusive populations we now call Denisovans leave behind tantalizing traces that suggest both wide distribution and deep significance, even though their bones remain maddeningly scarce. In Southeast Asia Island, worlds produce lineages that complicate every simple story of progress. Homo floresiensis persists in isolation, with its own strange mixture of traits. Homo luzonensis may represent another unexpected human experiment. Scholars still debate some classifications and relationships, because the evidence remains incomplete, and every new find has a way of unsettling what felt settled. But the overall picture is clear enough. Homo sapiens does not become different in isolation from other humans. It becomes different among them. This raises an obvious question, though not an easy one. If several human lineages are intelligent, social tool-using and adaptable, why does one path expand so dramatically, while others vanish, merge or contract into silence? The temptation is to look for one decisive superiority: better brains, better weapons, better language, better cooperation, better adaptability. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the outcome. Neanderthals, for example, are not simple failures awaiting replacement. They make tools with considerable skill, use fire, hunt large game, care for some injured individuals, and occupy demanding environments for far longer than modern civilization itself has yet existed. Denisovans, whatever their exact range and diversity, clearly interact genetically with later humans and seem to thrive across varied landscapes. The story is not one of dullness against brilliance. It is subtler, harsher, and more contingent than that. Still, there are differences that matter. One of the most important may be demographic rather than dramatic. A population does not need to be individually superior in every domain to outlast another. It may only need to be more connected slightly, more numerous, better at recovering from local losses, or more capable of moving knowledge across distances. Small differences in social network structure, mobility, or cultural accumulation can produce large effects over long timescales. A lineage that maintains wider exchange between groups may preserve innovation better. A lineage that tolerates broader diets may survive lean years more often. A lineage with greater symbolic cohesion may integrate strangers more effectively or retain memory through crisis with less loss. These not glamorous advantages, but in deep time they can be decisive. This is where the transformation described in the earlier sections may matter most. If later Homo sapiens becomes increasingly dependent on collective memory, flexible symbolic systems, extended social cooperation, and broad ecological range, then it may possess a distinctive resilience when environments swing or when groups must move into unfamiliar spaces. Resilience is not invincibility. Many Homo sapiens populations disappear too. Routes fail, coasts drown, technologies vanish. Entire local traditions are lost. But what survives in the record suggests that this lineage often carries a stronger capacity for cumulative repair. One group may fail, while another, connected through exchange or shared practice, continues the wider pattern. Knowledge need not remain trapped in one valley, one shoreline, one set of hands. Genetics adds another layer, and one of the strangest in all human history. Later humans do not simply replace other lineages. They meet them, and sometimes they have children with them. Neanderthal DNA persists in many populations outside Africa. Denisovan ancestry remains especially important in parts of Asia and Oceania, where it appears linked in some cases to adaptations that later become vital in specific environments. These are not footnotes. They mean that the disappearance of other humankinds is not pure erasure. It is also absorption, partial survival inside new forms. The old image of clean succession fails here. Human lineages do not just compete, they entangle. That entanglement makes the story more humane and more unsettling. It suggests encounters that range from violent to cooperative, opportunistic, to intimate, fleeting, to consequential. We do not know the emotional texture of those meetings. The record cannot tell us what a Neanderthal face looked like to an incoming sapiens child, Or what gestures passed between Denisovan-related populations and later migrants moving through difficult terrain? It cannot tell us whether such meetings were rare enough to be astonishing or common enough to become part of ordinary frontier life. But the genomes make one thing undeniable. These were not separate worlds sealed against one another. They touched, and in touching, they changed one another. Even so, the long arc is not equal. Neanderthals vanish as a distinct lineage. Denisovans vanish as a distinct lineage, at least in the forms we can currently identify. Island populations disappear. Other archaic branches fade before later history can know them. Homo sapiens persists and expands. Why competition for resources may be part of the answer. A lineage with slightly broader diet, denser social support, or faster innovation may gradually edge another out where ranges overlap. Climate instability may be part of the answer too, especially when populations are already sparse and fragmented. A cold pulse, a habitat shift, or the drowning of a coastal route can strike harder against smaller, less connected groups. Disease may have played some role, though direct evidence is sparse and caution is necessary. So too might simple demographic swamping, where incoming populations are numerous enough that interbreeding dissolves local distinctiveness across generations. What seems less convincing now is any single grand tale of immediate conquest. The disappearance of rival human lineages often unfolds across long periods, with overlap, repeated contact, regional variation, and uncertain boundaries. In some places, replacement may be relatively rapid. In others, coexistence likely lasts thousands of years. Scholars still debate the exact timing of some overlaps, and the reliability of particular dates, because dating methods, contamination issues, and incomplete stratigraphy complicate the picture. But the overall impression is not of one apocalyptic moment when modern humans arrive and every other human form simply collapses. It is of a drawn-out, uneven process in which flexibility numbers exchange chance and environmental stress all interact. One of the lesser-known but important details in this debate is how much geography itself shapes the contest. Mountain barriers, river systems, deserts, ice margins, forests and coasts do not merely separate populations. They filter contact and determine which kinds of adaptation matter. A cold-adapted lineage may flourish in one ecological belt but struggle when warming opens routes to more mobile competitors from elsewhere. A population dependent on certain prey species may be hit hard when vegetation shifts or hunting pressure changes. A lineage living partly in isolated pockets may find itself demographically brittle, even if locally well adapted. There is no universal stage on which all humans meet under equal conditions. The planet keeps creating local tests. And yet, despite all that local complexity, one broad difference continues to stand out. Later, Homo sapiens seems unusually good at carrying social and symbolic systems across changing environments. That matters because a species that can travel with portable identity, portable teaching, portable norms, and portable innovation has an advantage no anatomical adaptation alone can match. Cold can be met with techniques. New prey can be met with revised strategies. Strange coasts can be incorporated into diet. Unfamiliar groups can sometimes be allied with absorbed or at least read. This is not a guarantee of success, but it is a powerful way of surviving unpredictability. Other human lineages are capable and often remarkably so, but if they are more locally optimized and less broadly networked, they may prove more vulnerable when the world changes faster than bodies can. There is tragedy in this, though not the simple tragedy of heroes and losers. Each vanished lineage represents a way of being human that once worked sometimes for immense spans of time. Neanderthals are not failed apprentices to modernity. Denisovans are not merely mysterious genetic donors. Island lineages are not curiosities. They are evidence that humanity was once wider than the version of itself that survives. The world held several human answers to survival, several experiments in mind and body, several arrangements of memory, movement, and social life. Most are gone as distinct forms. What remains is not humanity in general, but one surviving branch of a once more varied tree. That recognition sharpens the question of what changed in us. If humans are different after the threshold, perhaps the clearest proof lies not only in tools or fire or symbolic marks, but in the outcome of this prolonged coexistence. One lineage becomes especially good at linking individuals into larger, more flexible cultural systems. It does not always win quickly. It does not remain pure. It borrows, merges, and carries traces of those it meets. But it persists. It keeps rebuilding. It keeps moving. It keeps turning local success into a wider pattern. By the end of this process, the human world is both richer and narrower. Richer because our own species carries within it some genetic memory of encounters with other humans, and perhaps some borrowed adaptations that matter profoundly. Narrower because the planet no longer hosts the full range of humankinds it once did. The rivals are gone as rivals. What remains is a species alone with its inheritance, triumphant only in the cold biological sense of having continued. That loneliness is easy to miss because it arrives so early, long before writing empire or history as later people understand it. But it is one of the great facts of our past. We are the descendants not simply of survivors, but of the last surviving human form to become global. The old crowd has thinned to one, and whatever happened once to make humans different after that threshold did not merely change how one lineage lived. It changed which lineage would remain to remember. The deeper the evidence is examined, the less satisfying a single answer becomes. That is often the mark of a real historical problem rather than a weak one. If this transformation in human life had been caused by one obvious event, one mutation, one invention, or one region acting alone, the record would likely feel cleaner than it does. Instead, it feels layered, regional, and stubbornly resistant to neat conclusion. Climate appears central but not sufficient. Anatomy matters, but anatomy does not explain culture by itself. Diet changes the body, but not every well-fed creature builds symbolic systems. Language is almost certainly important, yet language leaves no direct fossil behind. Social complexity explains much, though it may be as much a consequence as a cause. Scholars still debate the balance between these explanations because the evidence remains incomplete, and because no single explanation fully accounts for the scale of what happened. Climate is usually the first major candidate, and for good reason. The Pleistocene is not a stable stage on which human evolution politely unfolds. It is a period of repeated environmental instability, with shifts in rainfall temperature, sea level vegetation, and animal distribution that can reorder survival almost overnight in evolutionary terms. In Africa especially, long dry phases, wet pulses, fluctuating lakes, fragmenting habitats, and changing corridors may have forced populations into patterns of dispersal, isolation, reunion, and repeated adaptation. One influential line of thought argues that this variability is not merely background stress, but the selective engine itself. A lineage able to remain behaviorally flexible under fluctuating conditions would have an enormous advantage. This fits much of the evidence. Broad diets, portable knowledge, mobility, and social dependence all make sense in such a world, and yet climate alone cannot do the whole job. Many species live through unstable climates without becoming cumulative, symbolic creatures. Environmental stress can kill, fragment, and narrow as easily as it can stimulate. Harshness does not automatically produce complexity. It may simply erase those who cannot cope. So while climate likely provides the recurring pressure that makes flexibility valuable, It does not by itself explain why humans move so far into shared memory, symbolic behavior, and large-scale cooperation. Pressure creates the need. It does not guarantee the answer. The next explanation usually points inward toward cognition and brain organization. At some point, the argument goes humans become capable of more powerful abstraction, better working memory, finer social reasoning, longer planning horizons, or more recursive thought. This may involve changes in neural connectivity, developmental timing, or the extended childhood that allows large amounts of learned behavior to be acquired. The attraction of this explanation is obvious. It gets closer to the actual difference we're trying to understand. Humans, after the threshold, do not merely survive differently, they seem to think differently. Their minds hold more invisible structure. They organize action over longer spans and preserve more socially transmitted information. But this explanation also runs into limits. Brains do not fossilize. Cranial shape offers clues, but clues are not thought. Even when endocranial casts provide hints of size or organization, they cannot reveal the lived cognitive architecture that matters most. And there is another problem. Intelligence is not a switch. Earlier humans are already intelligent, already innovative, already socially aware. Neanderthals, for instance, do not fail because they lack cognition. So the real question is not whether later Homo sapiens becomes intelligent, but whether certain mental capacities become unusually well integrated with culture teaching and large social networks. If so, cognition matters deeply, but not as a single miraculous leap. It matters as part of a loop between mind and society. Language is perhaps the most tempting explanation of all, because it seems to solve several problems at once. Rich language could dramatically increase the precision of teaching, the coordination of group activity, the transmission of abstract rules, and the stability of symbolic systems. It could allow warning to travel beyond direct demonstration permit stories to preserve practical and emotional knowledge, and make social identity far more portable. Once language crosses a certain threshold, cumulative culture might accelerate rapidly. This is a serious and powerful argument, and few scholars would deny language a central place somewhere in the story. Still, language is infuriatingly difficult to date. There is no fossil of a sentence. Anatomy of the vocal tract, hyoid, bones, hearing capacities and genes associated with speech and language can all contribute suggestive evidence, but none provides a decisive clock. Moreover, communication exists on a continuum. Earlier humans almost certainly possess rich vocal and gestural systems. The debate is not between silence and speech, but between levels of complexity, flexibility, and symbolic depth. Did language become fully modern before the behavioral shift helping cause it? Did cultural complexity itself push language to become more elaborate? Did both processes reinforce one another? The cautious answer is probably yes to the loop and no to any simple timeline. Diet provides another compelling piece of the puzzle. Brains are expensive tissues. Longer childhoods are expensive. Social living is expensive. A lineage attempting to sustain larger populations, longer learning periods, and more energy-demanding neural development must secure enough calories and enough nutrient reliability to support the cost. This is where broader diets, cooking coastal resources, marrow extraction, and perhaps periodic access to nutrient-rich foods become relevant. Some researchers have emphasized the role of marine environment, shellfish, fish, and shoreline ecologies in supporting human cognitive and demographic expansion, especially in parts of Africa where coasts may have served as reliable refuges during hard inland phases. Others urge caution, noting that preservation biases and regional variation make sweeping claims dangerous. What survives in the record suggests diet matters, but not in one uniform way everywhere. The social explanation may be the strongest precisely because it is hardest to isolate. Human beings appear to become different not when any one skill improves in isolation, but when multiple skills become embedded in denser cooperation. Long childhoods encourage teaching. Teaching favors better communication. Better communication stabilizes techniques. Stable techniques increase reliability. Reliability supports group growth. Larger or more connected groups preserve innovation, better reduce the risk of knowledge loss, and foster symbolic markers of belonging. Belonging improves cooperation among non-immediate kin. Cooperation supports food sharing, child rearing, and mobility. This in turn helps populations survive unstable environments and spread into new ones. The transformation begins to look less like a single invention than a self-reinforcing social system. This is the idea of cumulative culture, and it may be the most important concept in the whole debate. Many animals learn socially. Some even show traditions. But humans appear to cross into something stronger improvements that do not vanish with one gifted individual but accumulate across generations. Once a technique can be preserved, refined, and taught widely enough, a group begins to benefit from discoveries it did not personally invent. The dead continue to help the living. That is an extraordinary threshold. It means cultural inheritance starts acting almost like a second evolutionary stream, faster than genes, more flexible than anatomy, but dependent on mind sociality, and enough continuity to survive disruption. And that brings us to demography. Population size and connectivity may sound dry compared with brains and symbols, but they are probably crucial. A brilliant innovation invented in a tiny isolated group may disappear in a generation if its carriers die or disperse. The same innovation in a larger or better connected network has a better chance of surviving, spreading, and being improved. Some scholars argue that the real transformation occurs when human groups become numerous enough and sufficiently linked to stabilize complex behaviors that small populations cannot reliably maintain. This is an appealing explanation because it helps account for why signs of symbolic or technological complexity can appear early in some places and then seem to fade while later they become harder to lose. Culture may need a certain density before it becomes durable. No single factor can be removed from this picture without weakening it. Climate creates the recurring need for flexibility. Diet and fire help support the energetic costs of larger brains, longer development and broader survival strategies. Language increases the precision of transmission. Social complexity deepens the importance of reputation cooperation and child-rearing networks. Population structure determines whether useful innovations persist or vanish. Symbolic behavior strengthens identity, memory, and coordination. Each factor amplifies the others. The transformation, in other words, may not be a cause at all but a convergence. This is unsatisfying only if one expects history to behave like myth. In reality, great changes often emerge when several slow-moving forces begin reinforcing one another until a threshold is crossed. Water does not become steam because of one molecule. A species does not become culturally cumulative because of one trait. What survives in the record suggests a long ratcheting process. Environmental uncertainty rewards flexibility. Flexibility favors cooperation and memory. Cooperation and memory favor better communication. Better communication favors denser tradition. Denser tradition allows symbolic worlds and durable teaching. Durable teaching improves survival across new environments. Expansion and connectivity then protect and spread the whole system. Once that loop becomes strong enough, humans are different after it, even if no one moment can be named as the turning point. There are, of course, fringe explanations that rise and fall around this mystery. Catastrophic one-time events lost advanced ancestors, Implausible interventions or grand civilizational myths projected back into deep time still attract attention because they offer the drama the real evidence denies us. But they remain unsupported. They confuse mystery with permission to invent. The actual story is more difficult and more credible. It asks us to accept that one of the greatest changes in our history may have happened gradually, unevenly, and without spectacle through interactions between ecology, biology and culture that no single surviving artifact can summarize. That complexity is not a weakness of the explanation. It is the explanation. Humans become different when they stop depending on one line of inheritance alone. Genes still matter, certainly. Bodies still matter. But now culture begins feeding back into selection and survival with unusual force. The environment no longer shapes humans only through the slow filter of anatomy. It shapes them through social systems that can change within lifetimes, yet leave consequences lasting millennia. That is the real revolution. So the debate over causes ends, if it ends at all, not with one answer, but with a pattern. The ancient human change that happened once and never truly reversed seems to arise when minds groups fire, food, language, landscape and memory all start locking together tightly enough that culture becomes a survival organ. After that, the species is no longer merely adapting to the world in biological time. It is adapting in historical time. And that is why everything afterward unfolds on a different scale. After the change, survival no longer belongs primarily to the strongest body in the immediate moment. Strength still matters, of course. So does speed, endurance, a good eye, a steady hand, the ability to stay calm when something dangerous breaks from cover. None of that disappears. But those traits are no longer enough on their own, and perhaps for the first time in the history of the human line, they are no longer the deepest source of advantage. The humans who endure after this threshold do so increasingly through planning, through the carrying of knowledge across distance and time, through teaching that preserves what one body learned for many others, and through a culture thick enough to shelter fragile lives that raw instinct alone would lose. This is what makes their survival a different kind of survival. Earlier humans had adapted impressively to difficult worlds, but later humans begin to adapt in a way that compounds. A harsh season is not just endured, it is remembered and folded into future behavior. A dangerous crossing is not just survived, it becomes part of group knowledge. A useful food source is not just exploited, it is revisited, timed, improved upon, and perhaps shared with neighboring groups. Once information begins to accumulate in this way, adaptation becomes less about starting over in every generation and more about inheriting advantages built by the dead. That is a decisive shift. It means human beings are no longer facing the world only with their bodies and a handful of immediate skills. They are facing it with stored experience. Planning is the clearest expression of this new survival. A group on the move is no longer reacting only to what lies before it. It may be heading toward a seasonal resource not yet visible, carrying materials that will matter later, or preserving fire for a camp not yet reached. A stone blank carried across miles, a remembered spring approached at the right time, a return to a shellfish-rich coast, when tides and season align, a choice to avoid a valley. Because rains have likely failed there before, these are all signs that humans are beginning to live inside anticipated futures. The future is still uncertain. Plans fail, landscapes shift, weather betrays expectation, but expectation itself has become normal. Humans are now routinely acting on things not yet present. Teaching makes this possible at scale. It is one thing for an individual to discover how to shape a better cutting edge, where to find a reliable raw material, or how to exploit a difficult food source. It is another for that knowledge to survive beyond the discoverer. The more human life depends on cumulative culture, the more valuable deliberate instruction becomes. Some teaching can be silent demonstration, repetition, correction, by gesture, the young watching hands at work by firelight. Some may be vocal and increasingly precise as language thickens. Either way, what matters is that the species becomes able to preserve improvements. This is no small change. It means one good idea no longer dies so easily. Children are at the center of this transformation. The long human childhood that once looked like a dangerous burden now becomes a vessel for inheritance. To be young in this changed human world is to spend years absorbing techniques, roots, social expectations, emotional cues, danger signals, food processing methods, and perhaps stories that preserve knowledge in memorable form. A child is no longer only a hungry small body that must somehow be kept alive until adulthood. A child is also the future storage site of group continuity. That makes teaching not a luxury but a survival system. It also means the protection of children acquires value beyond compassion. To preserve the young is to preserve the possibility that culture will continue intact. Adaptability grows from this. Humans after the threshold are not tied to one perfect habitat in the way many successful species are. They can live in forests, grasslands, coasts, river valleys, uplands, and margins that would challenge less flexible creatures. This does not mean every group thrives everywhere or that adaptation is effortless. But what survives in the record suggests that Homo sapiens becomes unusually good at building local strategies out of portable capacities. Fire goes where the group goes. Tool traditions go where the group goes. Social rules, symbolic markers, and teaching practices go where the group goes. Even identity itself can travel. That portability is one of the greatest survival advantages the species ever gains. It also changes how humans respond to disaster. A bad year still kills, a drought still scatters, a storm can still erase tracks, drown camps, and strip a region of predictability. Yet a culturally dense group may recover differently from such shocks than an earlier lineage would. It can fall back on remembered alternatives. It can split and reform. It can revise roots. It can preserve a technique through displacement. It can absorb newcomers or be absorbed without losing everything at once. This is not immunity. It is resilience. And resilience in a fluctuating Pleistocene world may matter more than raw efficiency in ideal conditions. There is a lesser known but revealing truth in this as well. Specialization becomes possible only because general support has deepened. A person can become especially skilled at tracking plant knowledge, toolmaking, childcare, fire maintenance, or reading weather, because the group is stable enough to make such expertise useful. In a purely immediate world, everyone must do almost everything badly and constantly. In a more structured world, variation can become strength. One person's attentiveness to social tension, another's patience with teaching, another's gift for remembering roots, another's eye for material quality, all of these can be folded into collective survival. Humans do not survive because every individual is equally capable in all things. They survive because culture lets differences interlock. This interlocking likely changes mobility too. Movement is no longer only flight from scarcity. It can become patterned circulation. Certain places are returned to because they are known, not merely stumbled upon. A landscape becomes seasonal in the mind before it becomes seasonal in the feet. People may leave one region with the expectation of return, carrying memory of when it becomes useful again. Such cyclical movement requires social discipline. It depends on the preservation of sequence, timing, and trust. It also produces a human relationship to land that is neither fully nomadic in the loose sense, nor settled in the later agricultural one. It is something more intricate, a geography of remembered usefulness. All of this increases the power of culture, but it also increases dependence on it. That is the hidden cost. The stronger cumulative knowledge becomes, the more dangerous its interruption becomes. A group that loses elders, teachers, or key traditions may find itself exposed in ways earlier humans were not. A route forgotten is not just a detail lost. It may mean missing water. A fire-making technique interrupted is not just inconvenience. It may mean cold illness and predator risk. A symbolic system fractured is not just emotional confusion. It may weaken trust cooperation and group identity. Humans after the threshold are stronger through culture, but also more vulnerable to cultural breakage. Their survival is no longer simply biological, it is infrastructural. This is why later expansions across the planet become so consequential. When Homo sapiens moves into new regions, it does not arrive empty. It arrives carrying cultural packages, tool traditions, social expectations, symbolic habits, dietary flexibility, fire use, and a capacity to improvise collectively. Some packages fail, some are transformed beyond recognition in new environments, some are lost entirely. But enough persists for the species to become astonishingly mobile. Deserts, coasts, forests, ice margins, islands, and river systems all become sooner or later part of the human range. No single explanation fully accounts for that success, but planning, teaching, and cumulative culture sit near its center. The old style of survival never disappears entirely. Hunger still has to be met mouth by mouth. Children still must be carried. Night still frightens. Weather still kills without ceremony. The human body remains vulnerable in almost every ancient way. But what changes is the layer wrapped around that vulnerability. Humans now meet danger not just with nerve and muscle, but with a fabric of inherited responses. They are still animals and very mortal ones, but they're no longer facing each new problem as if the species has never seen anything like it before. That may be the simplest definition of the new human condition. To be human after the threshold is to inherit solutions. Some of those solutions are precise, some partial, some mistaken, some burdensome, some life-saving. But inheritance itself is the revolution. The child does not begin at zero. The group does not begin at zero after each death. The species does not begin at zero after each climate swing. Something accumulates and remains available. That is why humans become different after this moment, and why the difference never fully goes away. From here onward, survival is increasingly historical. It depends on what came before, on what can be transmitted, on what can be revised without being lost. This is the beginning of a creature that can build worlds instead of merely occupying them. Not cities yet, not states, not writing, not machines. Only the deeper precondition of all those things, a species that lives through stored knowledge, social continuity, and anticipatory thought. A species that can survive not because it is strongest in the instant, but because it remembers, teaches, and plans. And once that becomes the dominant way of being human, the future changes shape. Every later achievement, every migration, every technology, every myth, every civilization, every collapse, every attempt to preserve something against time will grow from this older turning point. The humans who come after it are still fragile, still finite, still one bad season away from grief. But they are now armed with something no earlier creature has wielded quite the same way a past that can be used. The land keeps the memory even when people do not. That may be the strangest part of all this. Human lives vanish quickly in deep time. Skin rots, wood decays, fiber-hide woven things, spoken words, the whole soft fabric of ordinary existence disappears almost completely. What remains is partial and stubborn, a stain of charcoal in compacted sediment, a scatter of flakes where hands once worked stone, shells carried inland for reasons now silent, bones split for marrow, pollen trapped in layers of mud, shorelines stranded far from the sea that made them. The landscapes remember everything in fragments, and those fragments are enough to show that after the great human threshold, the relationship between people and place is no longer the old one. Before this change, landscapes are mostly pressures. They constrain movement, hide danger, offer brief opportunity, then withdraw it again. After the change, they are still all of those things, but they also become archives. A cave is not just shelter. It is a place returned to, modified by repeated occupation, blackened by generations of fire, marked by patterns of work and rest. A river crossing is not just where water can be forded. It is a known passage with remembered risks. A coastal margin is not just a place where sea meets land. It is a calendar written in tide season, shell beds, wind, and the habits of birds. The world itself begins to hold the shape of human knowledge. This is why the geological record matters so much in the story of human difference. Climate does not just form a background to human change, it leaves readable signatures that can be matched however imperfectly against shifts in behaviour. Lake cores rise and fall with wet and dry centuries. Ice cores record distant atmospheric conditions that ripple outward into altered winds and rainfall. Sediment layers preserve drought, flood, ashfall, erosion, pollen, change and vegetation collapse. Shorelines advance and retreat with sea level fluctuations driven by glacial cycles. These are not distant abstractions. They are the rearrangements that human groups must read, survive, and eventually anticipate. Scholars still debate the exact timing and local consequences of many climatic shifts, because environments vary sharply, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the broad pattern is clear. Human transformation is written into changing Earth systems. Caves are among the most eloquent witnesses because they compress long spans of time into stacked layers. In one band of sediment there may be charcoal, broken bone, stone flakes, and signs of repeated occupation. Above it, collapse or silence. Above that, a new return under different climatic conditions, perhaps, with altered tools, altered prey, altered rhythms of life. A cave can preserve not just presence but recurrence. It can reveal that people knew this place well enough to come back across years, seasons, or longer intervals. Repetition matters. Repetition is memory externalized. The group leaves, but the place remains ready to receive the same behaviors again. Open-air sites, though more fragile, tell something equally important. A cluster of napping debris near a water source, a butchery area marked by cut bone and broken stone, hearth traces in association with tool repair. Such sites suggest that land is increasingly used in patterned ways. It is not just crossed, it is organized. One zone yields stone, another yields shellfish, another is favorable for hunting at a certain season, another must be avoided after heavy rain. This is the beginning of landscapes understood as networks rather than accidents. Human beings are no longer simply passing through the earth, they are learning it in layers. Shorelines may hold some of the most tantalizing evidence, and also some of the greatest losses. Coasts can be rich environments offering shellfish fish, seabirds, stranded marine resources, edible plants, and navigable corridors. For populations under pressure, especially in fluctuating climates, such places may have provided important refuges and supported broader diets. Yet many ancient shorelines are now drowned beneath later seas. The evidence they once held is gone or difficult to access. This is one reason the record of early human transformation feels so unfair. Some of the very places that may have nurtured major changes are also the places least likely to preserve them in accessible form. What survives in the record suggests coastal life mattered more than older theories once assumed. but the full picture almost certainly lies partly underwater beyond easy recovery. Deserts remember differently. In regions now dry and severe traces of lakes, river systems, marshes and green corridors show that what looks impossible today was once livable, sometimes richly so. The Sahara is the classic example, though not the only one. There were times when grasslands, wetlands and animal-rich routes cut through areas now associated with emptiness. These windows mattered. They opened pathways, allowed dispersal, brought populations into contact, then closed again. A human group crossing such a corridor was not moving through timeless desert. It was moving through a temporary world. When that world vanished, the corridor became a barrier once more. Landscapes do not merely host history, they decide when certain histories are possible. This constant opening and closing helps explain the afterimage of human difference in the land itself. If later humans are better at carrying memory, coordinating movement and preserving cultural responses, then they are also better at exploiting temporary opportunity. A wet phase becomes a route. A rich estuary becomes a seasonal anchor. A cave near shifting ecotones becomes a dependable node between different resource zones. A source of high-quality stone becomes worth travelling back to or carrying from. The land keeps a record of this in the form of repeated use, transported materials, altered burning patterns, prey profiles and settlement traces. None of these signals alone proves a transformed humanity, but together they suggest a species increasingly capable of reading environmental change and embedding itself within it. There is a haunting asymmetry here. The more humans begin to organize life through culture, the more the land begins to preserve signs of that organization, yet the land still preserves only the hardest parts. We see the fireplace, not the conversation around it. We see the ochre fragment, not the face it may once have marked. We see the butchered bones, not the sharing that followed. We see the root in repeated occupation, not the warning story that helped hold it in memory. The record is always thinner than the life it represents. This is why uncertainty must remain part of the story. Scholars still debate how much can be inferred from any one site, and they should. The evidence remains incomplete. But incompleteness is not emptiness. The traces are enough to show structure, and structure is what matters. Footprints, when they survive, perhaps reveal this most vividly. Human prints in ancient mud, volcanic ash, or soft sediment are brief, almost accidental archives of coordinated movement. Adults and children together, a group moving in one direction, individuals passing along a water margin or across a changing plain. Such traces are fragile miracles. They remind us that landscape and human life meet not only in grand climatic patterns, but in single moments, a heel sinking. A child stumbling astride, shortened by burden, a pause where someone turned their weight. When later humans leave such traces, they are not just bodies moving. They are culture in motion, carrying roots, expectations, roles, and remembered destination. Landscapes also remember what humans destroy, though in this earlier period destruction is still modest by later standards. Repeated fire use may alter vegetation locally. Hunting pressure may affect prey patterns in certain zones. Preferred camps can compact surfaces, concentrate refuse, and shift animal behavior around them. These are still light marks compared with agriculture cities and industrial worlds to come, but they matter, because they show a new kind of reciprocity. Humans are no longer only being shaped by landscapes, they are beginning subtly to shape them in return. The great remaking of the planet lies far ahead, but its first faint logic may already be present. Repeated human behavior leaves environmental consequences, and later behavior unfolds inside those altered conditions. This may be one reason the ancient threshold is so hard to reverse. Once a species begins living through accumulated memory, its traces and its choices start feeding back into the environments it uses. Camps create familiarity. Familiarity encourages return. Return deepens knowledge. Deepened knowledge makes the site more useful, more structured, more meaningful. The same can happen with coastlines, hunting grounds, quarry sites, and routes between habitats. In this way, culture and landscape begin to weave together. The land teaches the people, but the people also begin teaching the land, impressing recurrent forms of use into it. And so the earth keeps the afterimage of the once, not as a neat narrative, not as a single datable transformation, but as a widening pattern of repeated occupation, transported matter, controlled fire, broadened diets, layered site use and climate-linked movement. The humans who come after the threshold are legible in the land because they increasingly turn place into memory, and memory back into place. That may be the most durable clue of all. Long before history in the written sense, the world is already becoming historical for humans. Caves, shorelines, lake basins, marsh edges, river crossings, high ridges, stone sources, and seasonal camps are no longer just physical features. They are part of inherited worlds. To enter them is to enter precedent. To leave them is to carry them onward. The species becomes different when it begins living this way, and the ground never quite forgets it. What was gained is easier to celebrate than what was lost, but both begin at the same moment. The human transformation that once seemed so clearly advantageous in the long arc of survival carries its own burden from the start. To remember more is to suffer more by memory. To cooperate more deeply is to become more exposed to betrayal, resentment, exclusion, and grief. To build social worlds thick enough to hold children, elders' knowledge and fragile futures is also to create the first conditions for pressure that no predator and no drought could impose alone. A species that becomes different by carrying more invisible structure inside itself also becomes vulnerable to the weight of that structure. The gain is obvious enough in outline. Humans after the threshold become better at enduring uncertainty. They preserve knowledge, widen their diets, organize space use fire more effectively, care for dependent young more successfully, and move through varied environments with the flexibility no earlier lineage seems to match at the same scale. They can survive hard seasons not just by luck, but by inheritance. They can remember danger plan around scarcity and build meaning into places and relationships. In the cold arithmetic of evolution, this is a staggering success. It helps explain why Homo sapiens becomes global, why rival lineages fade, and why later history unfolds on a human stage dominated by one surviving form. But adaptation has a price, and some of that price appears immediately. A creature that can anticipate the future is a creature capable of dread. Earlier humans fear what is present or imminent. Later humans begin increasingly to fear what might come. They can imagine failure before it happens. They can remember loss long after the body has recovered or the danger has passed. They can anticipate seasons of hunger, social fracture, or the consequences of a mistake not yet made. This ability is useful. It allows preparation. It is also costly. Anxiety in some very deep form may be built into the same capacities that make humans resilient. The evidence for emotional life in prehistory is necessarily indirect, but what survives in the record suggests a species growing more cognitively burdened as it grows more capable. Social life sharpens the burden. A looser association can dissolve with little more than practical inconvenience. A denser group cannot. Once survival depends heavily on food-sharing, child-rearing networks, skill transmission, and role differentiation, every strain in the group matters more. Jealousy is no longer just a feeling, it becomes a destabilizing force. Resentment over labor, conflict over mates, perceived unfairness in sharing distrust around leadership or route choice. All of these can now threaten not just comfort but continuity. This is one of the hidden contradictions of human success. The stronger cooperation becomes, the more dangerous social failure becomes. And with social depth comes hierarchy, however faint at first. Hierarchy need not begin as domination in the later political sense. It may begin simply as deference to the elder, who remembers, to the skilled napper, to the dependable fire tender, to the person whose judgment has proven right before. Such deference is practical, but once some people become more central to the functioning of the group than others, inequality of influence begins to appear. Influence brings tension. Whose memory is trusted? Whose decisions stand? Whose errors are forgiven? Whose children receive greater protection? These things are not yet institutions, but they are already more than chance. The human world after the threshold is not only warmer and more cooperative, it is also more political in embryo. There is loss in another sense too, and it is harder to see because it becomes the normal condition of our species. As culture thickens, instinct alone becomes less sufficient. Humans gain freedom through learning, but they also become more dependent on being taught well. A child raised without enough knowledge is not simply inexperienced. That child is at risk in ways a more purely instinctive creature might not be. A group that loses key practices may not merely become less efficient, it may become catastrophically vulnerable. This is the danger of cumulative culture. It produces extraordinary adaptive power, but it also creates failure modes that did not previously exist. Ignorance becomes deadlier. Forgetting becomes structural damage. That means every gain in complexity brings a corresponding fragility. Fire extends, the day warms the body and broadens the diet, but it must be maintained. Symbolic systems preserve memory and identity, but they can also divide, exclude, and intensify fear. Group roles improve coordination, but they can harden into dependence, expectation, and pressure. Longer childhood allows deep learning, but it also prolongs vulnerability and raises the cost of every failed season. Humans become stronger through culture, but culture makes them easier to wound in new ways. There may also be a cost in immediacy itself. A species increasingly shaped by memory and anticipation is never fully present in the moment in the old animal sense. It is carrying absences, expectations, social obligations, and meanings that shadow each action. A river is not just water now. It is the site of prior danger, future necessity, remembered crossing, perhaps even inherited taboo. Another person is not just another body. They are kin or rival helper or unreliable partner bearer of reputation, possible source of grievance or alliance. Every place and every relationship thickens. This is an extraordinary cognitive achievement, but it may also mark the end of a simpler kind of being alive. That simplicity should not be romanticized. The earlier world is not peaceful, innocent, or free. It is brutal, narrow, and full of risk. Yet there is a kind of directness to it that later humanity increasingly loses. When survival becomes historical, symbolic, and socially layered, life gains meaning but also complication. Humans become creatures who can no longer merely eat, move, sleep, and mate inside an environment. They must now navigate systems of belonging, memory, expectation, and self-restraint. The old world asked whether the body would survive the night. The new one asks that too, but also whether the group will hold, whether knowledge will carry, whether trust will break, whether meaning itself can endure. There is another loss hidden inside success, the narrowing of humanity. As Homo sapiens expands, other human lineages vanish or are absorbed. The world loses not just biological diversity, but alternative forms of human existence. Whatever Neanderthals knew in their own way, whatever Denisovan-related populations were in their lived social worlds, Whatever island lineages represented in body and mind those modes of being human do not continue as distinct paths. The triumph of one lineage is also the extinction of others. We gain one global humanity, but we lose the wider human field from which it emerged. That loss is rarely felt because it precedes written memory, but it is part of the inheritance all the same. Even within Homo sapiens, increased cultural density may narrow behavior in subtler ways. Once norms take hold, certain kinds of variation become harder to tolerate. Once social expectations stabilize, individuals must fit themselves to roles more often than before. This likely begins very early. A group dependent on cooperation cannot indulge every impulse. It rewards reliability, attentiveness, memory, and conformity to shared practice. That does not erase individuality, but it does press more firmly against it. The same social order that protects children and preserves knowledge may also create shame, discipline, and suppression. Survival becomes less solitary, but also less free. Scholars still debate how far back these costs can be projected with confidence, because emotional and social burdens do not fossilize. The evidence remains incomplete. No cave layer records anxiety directly. No hearth preserves humiliation. No shell bead can prove hierarchy. Yet what survives in the record, combined with the logic of increasingly dense social dependence, strongly suggests that human evolution is not a story of pure gain. It is a story of trade-offs. We become more adaptable by becoming more entangled. We become more resilient by becoming more dependent. We become more meaningful by becoming harder to settle. This matters because the later human world, with all its cities, laws, religions, wars, kin systems, social anxieties, symbolic identities, and constant negotiation between self and group, does not appear from nowhere. It has roots here. The first faint pressures of reputation, expectation, deference, exclusion, fear of future scarcity, and burden of memory are already taking shape in deep prehistory. Civilization does not invent them. It magnifies them. The seed is older than agriculture, older than monuments, older than writing. It begins when humans become the species that must carry more than one life at a time inside the mind. So what was gained was immense. A planet-spanning adaptability, the ability to preserve and build on knowledge, the possibility of caring for the weak, teaching the young, surviving climate swings, and creating worlds of meaning. What was lost was quieter, but real. Ease, simplicity, some instinctive sufficiency, other human alternatives, and perhaps a certain peace that belongs only to creatures who do not know so much about one another or about what tomorrow might bring. This is the paradox at the center of the human change. The very traits that let us endure also make us restless. The very capacities that preserve us also burden us. We become harder to kill by tooth cold and hunger, but easier to wound by memory, fear, and one another. After that, survival is never again a simple matter of living through the day. It becomes a matter of carrying the weight of being human. From that point onward, the inheritance never stops unfolding. It does not move in a straight line, and it does not improve in every direction, but it accumulates. A species that has crossed into cumulative culture, deeper cooperation, symbolic life, and anticipatory survival cannot easily return to the older condition, because its future is no longer being built generation by generation from near zero. It is being built from carried worlds. Every migration afterward, every settlement, every experiment in living together, every new tool, every ritual, every system of memory, every collapse and recovery, all of it grows from this earlier transformation. Long before civilization, the architecture of civilization is already present in human life. The first and most obvious sign of that inheritance is movement. Humans do not merely survive local conditions more effectively after the threshold. They begin to move outward across extraordinary distances, carrying enough flexibility and enough cultural continuity to make new landscapes habitable. This does not happen in one burst, nor does it proceed without reversals, failures, dead ends, and populations that vanish from the record. But the broader pattern is unmistakable. Homo sapiens leaves Africa in waves or pulses perhaps more than once, and spreads into regions already occupied by other human lineages, into climates far colder than those in which the species first emerged, into coasts, forests, grasslands, mountains, river systems, and eventually islands that require unusually complex navigation and planning. A body alone does not explain this. A body with stored knowledge does. Everywhere humans go, they carry more than tools. They carry social forms, however flexible. They carry ways of teaching children, dividing effort, maintaining fire, recognizing belonging, reading danger, remembering places and attaching significance to materials and marks. Those carried structures are not identical in every group. They change quickly under different ecological pressures. They split, merge, and adapt. But they are portable enough to allow continuity under movement. This is one of the great consequences of the ancient turning point. Human beings become the animal that can travel with an invisible homeland inside the group. That portability matters because new environments are never blank. A coastline in Arabia, a grassland in Eurasia, a forest margin in Southeast Asia, a glacial frontier in Europe, a river plain somewhere beyond any earlier known range, all of these demand local solutions. Yet the species increasingly arrives with the capacity to improvise from prior inheritance, rather than invent everything anew. Fire remains useful, symbolic identity remains useful, shared child-rearing remains useful, planning remains useful. Tool traditions can be modified, but the habit of cumulative modification is already in place. The evidence remains incomplete in many regions, and debates over routes, timings, and population structure are far from settled. But what survives in the record suggests that humans succeed because they can turn prior cultural strength into local adaptation again and again. At some point, this begins to produce visible explosions of creativity and reach. Upper Paleolithic Europe is the most famous case, though. It should not be mistaken for the sole birthplace of symbolic or behavioral modernity. By then, caves hold astonishing paintings, carved figures appear, ornaments multiply toolkits, diversify further, and long-distance exchange of materials becomes easier to trace. But these later flourishes are not sudden miracles from nowhere. They are the flowering of capacities already seeded deep in the earlier threshold. Europe preserves them dramatically because of its caves and research history, not because humanity is born there. The inheritance is older, wider, and more complex. What later bursts into view had long been gathering elsewhere in quieter, harder to preserve forms. The same can be said of ritual and identity. Once humans become creatures who live by cumulative meaning as well as cumulative technique, every later symbolic system becomes thinkable. Burial traditions, body marking, carved signs, repeated motifs, sacred places, totems, mythic narratives, ancestor attention, territorial identities. All of these are later elaborations of a more ancient human capacity to store significance socially. Scholars still debate many specifics because symbolism is difficult to read even in relatively recent prehistory, and one must avoid turning every mark into a grand ideology. Still, the broader line is clear. The human inheritance after the threshold is not just practical knowledge. It is meaning made transmissible. This matters even more once human groups begin settling more intensively in particular places. Seasonal return deepens into habitual occupation. Habitual occupation under the right conditions edges toward longer residence. Longer residence encourages more structured use of space, more investment in place, more elaborate storage of food and tools, and greater sensitivity to territorial boundaries. Agriculture is still far ahead for most of this story, but the preconditions of later sedentism are already present in the older human inheritance place: memory, social coordination, symbolic identity planning beyond the present, and the ability to preserve know-how across generations. When farming eventually emerges in different regions of the world, it does not create cumulative humanity. It exploits it. The same is true of art, law, religion, and social hierarchy. None of these appears fully formed in the Paleolithic, yet all of them become possible because the species has already learned how to externalize memory and code norms, maintain shared meanings, and bind the living to the dead. A later temple is impossible without older habits of sacred attention. A later kinship system is impossible without older habits of collective child-rearing and remembered relatedness. A later political order is impossible without older patterns of deference, conflict management, and role differentiation. A later archive is impossible without older instincts to preserve the absent in signs. The long human inheritance is not civilization itself, but civilization's deep grammar. There is another consequence too, and it is easy to miss because it becomes so familiar. Once humans live through cumulative culture, every generation becomes born into a world already thick with unseen labor. The sheltering fire, the preferred stone source, the route to water, the timing of a seasonal return, the treatment of the dead, the marks of belonging, the expectations of sharing, the warnings tied to certain places, all of these are inherited before any child understands them. This is still true in the modern world at unimaginable scale, but its origin lies here. The later human condition is one in which no one begins alone. Each person starts inside systems built by others. That is perhaps the deepest meaning of inheritance in the human sense. It is not merely what is passed down physically. It is what surrounds the individual before choice begins. A child of the later Paleolithic, a child of the first villages, a child of ancient river civilizations, a child born under empire, a child born in the industrial age, each inherits not just genes and land, but the accumulated solutions and burdens of prior minds. The content changes. The principle does not. Humans remain the species remade by what they receive from the dead, and because of that the old turning point continues to echo through every later threshold. Migrations into Australia, the peopling of the Americas, the spread across island chains, the rise of symbolic art, the domestication of plants and animals, the formation of cities, the building of states, the creation of writing, the codification of laws, the emergence of religions that bind millions, who never meet the development of sciences that allow humans to describe the planet and then alter it at scale. None of these can be understood apart from that earlier transformation in how humans store and transmit life. They differ in content, not in fundamental structure. Each is another extension of cumulative being. No single explanation fully accounts for why later history takes the specific forms it does. Geography matters, chance matters, resource distribution matters, path dependence matters. Some societies remain mobile by choice and skill rather than lagging behind some imagined ladder. Others settle and intensify. Some develop writing. Others preserve immense memory without it. The inheritance expresses itself in many forms, but beneath the variation lies the same human substrate, a species that became different once by learning to survive through shared worlds, dense enough to outlast individuals. There is strange humility in this if one looks at it clearly. Modern humans like to imagine themselves as separated from the deep past by technology literacy or scale, and in obvious ways they are. But the central mechanism of human life remains ancient. We still survive through things no one person could invent alone. We still depend on knowledge we did not create. We still live inside symbols, identities, stories, obligations, and planned futures. We still inherit the labor of the dead and pass altered versions forward. The inheritance has grown almost unbearably large, but it is structurally the same kind of inheritance first consolidated in prehistory. So when later civilizations rise, they do not represent an escape from the old human threshold. They represent its continuation under new conditions. Cities are larger hearths with walls and bureaucracy. Writing is memory made durable beyond the body. Religion is symbolic coordination scaled across strangers. Law is group expectation formalized. Agriculture is environmental planning fixed into the ground. Trade is exchange widened beyond kin and locality. Empire is cooperation, and hierarchy expanded until they become dangerous abstractions. None of it is imaginable without the older transformation in which survival itself became social, cumulative, and meaning-laden. That is the long human inheritance, not a single tradition, not one uninterrupted culture, not a straight path from cave to city, but a changed mode of being that once set humanity onto a new track. After that, every later world carries the mark of the once. Landscapes become historical. The dead remain present in the living. Children inherit more than bodies can explain. Knowledge ceases to die so easily, and the species begins making futures out of memory. Now the mystery arrives where it has always been heading, which is to say here inside the ordinary modern human mind. Not in a museum case, not in a cave sealed by stonefall, not in a drowned shoreline or a scatter of ochre under ancient sediment, but in the fact that the change which happened once never stopped living forward. The old threshold is over in the archaeological sense. The bones have settled, the rival lineages are gone, the camps are ash, the roots have been erased and rewritten 1,000 times, and still its consequences remain so intimate that they are easy to mistake for human nature in the abstract when in fact they are the inheritance of a particular turning point in deep time. We're still living after the once. The most obvious mark is that no human being enters the world ready for the world. This is so familiar that it scarcely feels strange, yet it is one of the strongest clues that our species was remade by cumulative dependence. A human infant is not merely weak. It is unfinished in a way that makes culture unavoidable. Long childhood, deep learning imitation, symbolic absorption, emotional calibration, language, acquisition, moral instruction, memory training, all of it still defines the species. Modern institutions may formalize these processes into family, school, religion, state, and media, but the underlying pattern is much older. We remain the animal whose survival depends on being installed into an inherited system. The ancient change did not end with better tools. It became the basic condition of human development. That is why modern life, for all its apparent novelty, still turns on the same old structures. We live by stored knowledge we did not create. We trust roots we did not discover. We eat food produced by systems whose depth far exceeds our personal understanding. We carry symbols that tell others who we are before we speak. We organize ourselves by reputations, expectations, delayed rewards, invisible rules, remembered dangers, imagined futures and obligations to people not presently before us. Technology has multiplied the scale almost beyond recognition, but not the logic. The logic is Paleolithic in its bones. Humans remain creatures who survive through accumulated worlds shared across minds. Even our anxiety belongs to this inheritance. The modern mind is often treated as though it were simply malfunctioning under recent pressures, and in many specific ways that is true enough. Yet beneath those modern distortions lies something older. We are a species built to remember danger, anticipate shortage, track social standing, read intention, fear, exclusion, imagine the future, and carry the absent into the present. These capacities once helped small groups survive volatile landscapes, predators, hunger, and uncertain alliances. In the contemporary world, they can be amplified into chronic unease, but their roots are deep. The same system that lets humans plan care, cooperate, and preserve fragile lives also makes them vulnerable to dread, guilt, shame, loneliness, and longing. The old burden did not disappear when the predators moved farther from the firelight. It came indoors with us. The same is true of our attachment to meaning. Humans still cannot live comfortably in a world reduced to raw matter and immediate utility alone. We mark bodies, we sanctify places, we build narratives around suffering and survival. We preserve the dead in memory, image, ritual, lore, and record. We form group identities that can protect or destroy. We bind information to emotion so it will not be forgotten. Scholars still debate the precise origins of symbolic thought in the deep past because the evidence remains incomplete, and meanings do not fossilize cleanly, but the broad continuity is unmistakable. We are still the species that overlays the visible world with an invisible one and then lives according to both. There is also a more material continuity. Humans remain astonishingly good at expanding into environments that did not originally suit them, not because our bodies change fast enough to match every climate, but because culture continued doing the work of adaptation. Clothing shelter, agriculture, engineering medicine, writing transport refrigeration, digital memory. All of these are later extensions of the same ancient move, the outsourcing of survival into cumulative systems. We remain biologically fragile. Remove enough of the inherited structure around us, and that fragility becomes obvious at once. We are not the strongest, fastest, toughest, or most self-sufficient creatures on Earth. We are the most infrastructural. That has been true for a very long time, and because it has been true for so long, it is easy to overlook the danger embedded in it. What was true in prehistory remains true now. Humans become stronger through culture, and more vulnerable to cultural failure. A group that loses key knowledge still suffers. A society that cannot maintain trust, transmission, cooperation, and material support still weakens rapidly. The scales are larger now, but the principle is unchanged. Forgetting remains dangerous. Broken continuity remains dangerous. Social fracture remains dangerous. We still depend on things no individual can hold alone. What changed once in the deep past was not simply an increase in cleverness. It was the beginning of a permanent human condition of interdependence. This is why the old mystery matters more than curiosity alone would suggest. It is not merely a question about when symbolic behavior emerged, or how fire use deepened, or why one human lineage outlasted another. It is a question about why the human animal is so unlike any simpler image it tells about itself. We are not lone hunters by nature. We are not isolated, rational minds dropped cleanly into the world. We are not purely biological beings whose culture sits on top like decoration. We are organisms braided with inheritance. We are creatures made by remembered others. The change that happened once was the consolidation of that braid into something strong enough to carry the species forward. After that, no human life would ever again begin from the body alone. One of the strangest consequences of this is how close the ancient world still remains beneath the surface of the present. Beneath every archive lies the older act of preserving absence. Beneath every school lies the older act of teaching by the hearth. Beneath every border and flag lies the older symbolic marking of belonging. Beneath every city lies the older making of inside and outside center, and edge shared light against surrounding dark. Beneath every anxiety about status lies the older pressure of surviving within a group whose approval mattered. Beneath every ritual of burial, remembrance, and grief lies the older refusal to let the dead disappear entirely from the life of the living. Modernity did not invent these things, it inherited and scaled them. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail of how that inheritance came to be. There are still gaps in the record. There always will be. Important shorelines are drowned, key sites destroyed, entire chapters of human experimentation lost. Scholars still debate dates, roots, meanings, causes, and the relative weight of climate, demography, language, cognition, and social complexity. They should. The uncertainty is honest. But uncertainty about mechanism does not erase the outcome. Humans after a certain threshold are different in a durable way, and all later history unfolds inside that difference. That may be the final lesson of the mystery. Human beings often imagine their greatness in terms of domination, invention, or triumph over nature. But the deeper truth may be less flattering and more beautiful. What changed us was not conquest first. It was dependence on one another, dependence on memory, dependence on the dead, dependence on meanings held in common, dependence on fragile systems tended carefully enough to outlast the individual body. Humans became different when survival stopped being solitary in any meaningful sense and became historical, shared, cumulative, and emotionally charged. We still live like that. Every ordinary day proves it. Every word we speak comes from others. Every skill rests on prior instruction. Every institution, whether kind or cruel, is an inheritance. Every future we imagine is built from symbols we did not invent alone. The old turning point is not behind us in the way a finished event is behind us. It remains active in every human life because it altered the basis on which human life proceeds at all. So the once is not only a thing that happened, it is the condition under which we continue happening. Somewhere in the deep past, amid climate swings, fragile groups, firelight fear, teaching movement, and the first thickened worlds of memory humans crossed a threshold from which there was no real return. Afterward they still starved, still grieved, still vanished in great numbers, still misunderstood the forces around them, still carried violence and error inside their changed minds. But they also carried one another in a new way, and from that moment to this one, everything recognizably human has unfolded inside the echo of that change. The wind down begins where the evidence grows quiet. A hearth darkens the floor of a cave, then cools. Footprints fade from wet ground. A shell once carried inland for reasons we can no longer fully recover lies under centuries of dust. The child who watched the fire is gone. The elder who remembered the root is gone. The hunters, the gatherers, the fearful, the patient, the injured, the careful, the difficult, the beloved, all of them pass into the earth without names. And yet something of them remains not only in the stone and ash they leave behind, but in the way human life itself continues to be organized. That may be why the story lingers so strangely. It is not the story of a lost empire or a vanished city where the past feels sealed behind ruins. It is the story of a transformation still underway in us, even after all this time. We still gather around forms of fire, though now they glow behind glass and circuitry. We still inherit knowledge we did not make. We still fear exclusion, seek belonging. Teach the young, preserve the dead, mark ourselves with meanings, and move through landscapes layered with memory. The world is larger now, louder, denser with symbols than those first changed humans could possibly have imagined. But the deeper pattern is recognizably the same. Somewhere very far back, the human animal stopped being only a body among bodies. It became a creature that could carry absent things forward, warnings, roots, loyalties, techniques, Stories, losses, obligations, futures. That gift made survival wider than instinct. It also made life heavier. No single explanation fully accounts for how the change took hold, and the evidence will always remain partly broken, partly drowned, partly hidden under later time. But enough survives to see the outline. Something happened once slowly and irrevocably, and humans were different after, so the final image is not of triumph. It is quieter than that. A small group sits within a ring of light while darkness presses all around. Beyond the fire there is hunger, weather, animal breath, and the immense uncertainty of the old world. Within it there is warmth, memory, teaching, fear held in common, and the first fragile shape of everything to come. The flames sink lower, voices soften, the night remains enormous. But from that narrow circle onward, humanity is no longer facing it alone.